Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Welcome, viewers. Today, we journey through the vast expanse of time itself, tracing the history of the galaxy from its ancient origins to the grim darkness of the far future. This is the complete timeline of Warhammer 40,000, a tale that spans millions of years, encompasses civilizations beyond counting, and chronicles the rise and fall of empires that would make the gods themselves tremble. Settle in, for we have much ground to cover in our exploration of humanity's place in a universe that knows only war. Part 1. The Ancient Galaxy and the War in Heaven. Long before humanity took its first breath, before terror knew the touch of civilization, the galaxy was a place of wonder and horror beyond our comprehension. In those primordial ages, when the universe itself was young, two ancient races held dominion over the stars. Their conflict would shape the very fabric of reality, and the scars of their war still bleed into the present day. The Old Ones were the first. These beings, ancient beyond reckoning, possessed mastery over the fundamental forces of the universe. They were scientists, philosophers, and architects of life itself. With powers that seemed divine, they seeded countless worlds with biological wonders, creating new species as an artist might create paintings. They moved through the webway, a dimension of their own construction that existed outside the tumultuous currents of the warp, allowing instantaneous travel across vast cosmic distances without the dangers of chaos-tainted space. The Old Ones were not warlike by nature. They were gardeners of creation, nurturers of potential, shepherds guiding the evolution of lesser races. Among their greatest creations were the Eldar, a species crafted with such care and precision that they would inherit psychic powers second only to their makers. The Old Ones also shaped the crude fungal organisms that would one day become the Orcs, creating them as soldiers and warriors to fight in their defense. Even the primitive ancestors of humanity may have felt the Old One's gentle hand, though this remains a matter of conjecture among the few who still remember those distant days. But the Old Ones were not alone in the ancient galaxy. Another race, far different in nature, had awakened to consciousness. The Necrontyre, as they called themselves, were a people defined by suffering. Their homeworld orbited a dying star, and its radiation poisoned their flesh from birth. The Necrontyre were brilliant. Their civilization advanced beyond measure, but they were dying. Every member of their race was afflicted with cancers and mutations, their lives brutally short, even as their minds grasped toward eternity. They looked upon the Old Ones with bitter envy, for the ancient beings seemed to possess the secret of immortality that the Necrontyre so desperately craved. The Necrontyre begged the Old Ones to share their secrets, to grant them the gift of extended life. But the Old Ones, in their wisdom, or perhaps their arrogance, refused. They saw in the Necrontyre a race consumed by bitterness and resentment, and they would not entrust such power to beings whose souls were so darkened by suffering. This rejection planted seeds of hatred that would grow into a war of unimaginable proportions. Unable to extend their lives through the Old One's gifts, the Necrontyre turned inward, focusing their entire civilization on a single purpose: survival at any cost. They developed technology that rivaled and in some ways surpassed that of the Old Ones, creating weapons that could unmake stars and vessels that sailed between dimensions. But technology alone could not grant them what they truly desired. Death still stalked every Necrontyre from cradle to grave, an inescapable shadow that mocked their every achievement. It was in their darkest hour that the Necrontyre encountered beings that would change their fate forever. Deep in the material realm, in places where reality grew thin, they found the entities known as the Citan, the star gods. These creatures were ancient intelligences that fed upon the energy of stars themselves, vast and terrible beings of living metal and hungry light. They were few in number, each one unique, and they possessed powers that seemed to transcend the laws of physics. The Necrontyr made a pact with these star gods, a bargain that would damn their entire race. The C'tan promised the Necrontyr freedom from their frail, dying flesh. They would be transferred into bodies of living metal, imperishable and eternal, immune to disease and the ravages of time. In their desperation, the Necrontyr leadership accepted without fully understanding the price. In a single, catastrophic transformation, the entire Necrontyr species was uploaded into mechanical bodies, becoming the Necrons. But the gift came with a curse beyond imagining. The transfer process stripped away their souls, leaving behind only cold consciousness, trapped in metal shells. The Necrons discovered too late that they had traded their mortality for something worse than death, an eternal existence devoid of emotion, creativity, or meaning. They had become slaves to the C'tan, who fed upon the life energy that had been stripped from the Necrontyr in their transformation. Entire populations were rendered into pure energy to satiate the endless hunger of the star gods. The newly formed Necrons, led by their silent king Zarek and empowered by the reality-warping abilities of the C'tan, turned their rage upon the Old Ones. What followed was the War in Heaven, a conflict so vast and terrible that it nearly destroyed the galaxy itself. Whole star systems were obliterated, entire regions of space were rendered uninhabitable, and the very laws of reality were bent and broken by weapons of impossible power. The Old Ones, for all their mastery, found themselves pressed to the brink of extinction. They responded by accelerating the development of their created races, imbuing the Eldar with greater psychic potential, and creating new warrior species to fight alongside them. But their desperation had unintended consequences. The psychic awakening of so many souls, combined with the death and suffering of the war, began to stir something in the warp. You see, the warp had not always been the nightmare realm of chaos that we know today. In those ancient times, it was karma, a sea of psychic energy that reflected the emotions of living beings, but was not yet dominated by the malevolent entities we call demons. The War in Heaven changed that forever. The psychic echoes of billions dying in fear and rage began to corrupt the warp, giving birth to the first creatures of chaos. The Imperium transformed from a relatively benign parallel dimension into a hellspace of nightmare and madness. As the war ground on for millions of years, both sides paid terrible prices. The Old Ones, despite their power, began to fall. One by one, the last of these ancient beings perished, their secrets dying with them. The webway remained, a testament to their genius, but its creators were gone, leaving behind only the races they had nurtured to carry on without them. The Necrons, meanwhile, had achieved a hollow victory. They had destroyed their hated enemies, but in doing so, they had doomed themselves to an eternity of servitude to the C'tan. It was the Silent King, Zarek, who finally recognized the full horror of what his people had become. In a moment of desperate cunning, he turned the Necrons' weapons against their masters. The C'tan, for all their power, had not anticipated betrayal from their slaves. What followed was called the Shattering. The Necrons rose up against the star gods, using weapons specifically designed to harm beings of pure energy. The C'tan could not be destroyed entirely, for they were fundamental forces of the universe, but they could be broken. The Necrons shattered the C'tan into countless fragments, imprisoning these shards in tesseract labyrinths of impossible geometry. Some Necron dynasties kept these shards as weapons or power sources, while others simply sought to keep them contained for all eternity. But the Necrons' victory over the C'tan came too late to save them. The War in Heaven had left the galaxy in ruins, and the Necrons themselves were exhausted. Their numbers greatly diminished despite their immortal bodies. The new chaos entities stirring in the warp posed a threat that even the Necrons could not easily counter. for chaos fed on consciousness itself, and the Necrons, despite losing their souls, still possessed a form of awareness that chaos could potentially corrupt or destroy. The Silent King made a final, desperate decision. The Necrons would enter into the Great Sleep, a period of hibernation that would last millions of years. They constructed tomb worlds throughout the galaxy, vast underground complexes where entire armies would slumber in stasis, waiting for a time when the galaxy had recovered from the wars and the threat of chaos had diminished. The Silent King programmed their awakening protocols to activate in stages, ensuring that the Necrons would rise again when the conditions were right to reclaim their ancient dominion. As the last Necrons entered their tombs, the galaxy they left behind was fundamentally transformed. The war in heaven had killed the old ones, shattered the Citan, and left the warp forever corrupted by chaos. The younger races, the Eldar among them, inherited a broken galaxy, but they also inherited a universe free from the immediate dominance of the ancient powers, a universe where they could forge their own destinies. The Eldar, in particular, flourished in the absence of the old ones. They spread across the galaxy, building a civilization of unparalleled sophistication and beauty. The Elder Empire, at its height, encompassed millions of worlds and trillions of souls. They mastered the webway that their creators had left behind, using it to bind their empire together and shield themselves from the dangers of the warp. Their psychic powers grew ever stronger, and they used these abilities to shape reality itself according to their desires. For millions of years, the Eldar reigned supreme. They had no meaningful rivals. The Necrons slumbered in their tomb worlds, the Orcs devolved into scattered tribes of primitive savages, and the other younger races posed no threat to Eldar dominance. This was the age of the Eldar Empire, a time of art and philosophy, of psychic mastery and technological wonder. The Eldar seemed destined to rule the galaxy forever, but within their success lay the seeds of their destruction. As the Eldar civilization grew more advanced, they found themselves with less and less to struggle against. Life became too easy. Every desire could be fulfilled with a thought, every want satisfied instantly. Without hardship to define them or goals to pursue, the Elder began to seek new experiences, more intense sensations to fill the void of their perfect existence. At first, this manifested as artistic experimentation, philosophical exploration, the pursuit of excellence in increasingly esoteric fields. But gradually, inexorably, the Eldar's quest for new experiences turned darker. They began to indulge in excess for its own sake, seeking pleasure and pain in equal measure simply to feel something in lives that had become too perfect to have meaning. Cults formed around the pursuit of the most extreme sensations, and what had begun as innocent exploration turned into depravity that would make lesser beings recoil in horror. This descent into decadence was not immediate. It took thousands of years for the Eldar to fall so far, but with each passing generation, their civilization became more focused on sensation and less concerned with consequence. The Eldar's psychic nature meant that their emotions resonated in the warp, and as they gave themselves over to increasingly dark pleasures, these echoes began to accumulate in the Imperium. In the warp, something was stirring. The collective psychic emanations of trillions of Eldar, indulging in every conceivable excess, were coalescing into a new form, a new god being born from their corruption. This nascent entity fed on their dark emotions, growing stronger with each passing year, gathering power from the very civilization that was inadvertently creating it. The Eldar seers began to sense something terrible approaching, but by then, it was too late to stop what they had set in motion. A few Eldar recognized the danger and tried to warn their people. These voices of reason spoke of returning to the old ways, of restraint and discipline, of abandoning the path of excess before it led to their doom. but their warnings went largely unheeded. The majority of Eldar society was too deep in its spiral of depravity to turn back, too addicted to sensation to accept the bland alternative of moderation. Some Eldar, seeing the writing on the wall, chose to leave. They built massive spacecraft called craft worlds, small planet-sized vessels that would carry them far from the heart of their empire. These exodites, as they came to be called, sought to preserve something of traditional Eldar culture, to survive whatever catastrophe the seers predicted. Others fled to the edges of the galaxy, settling on primitive worlds where they could live simple lives close to nature, away from the corruption of their core civilization. But the vast majority of Eldar remained, either oblivious to the coming storm or too arrogant to believe it could truly threaten them. They continued their descent into darkness, and in the warp, the thing they were creating grew ever stronger, ever hungrier, ever closer to the moment of its terrible birth. Part 2. The Fall of the Elder and the Birth of Slaanesh. The moment of the fall came suddenly, like a dam bursting after years of mounting pressure. In the year that would later be designated as the beginning of the 30th millennium in the human calendar, approximately 10,000 years before the current era, the nascent Chaos God achieved critical mass. In a single catastrophic instant, she who thirsts was born. The psychic shockwave of Slaanesh's birth tore through the warp like a tsunami of pure agony. At the heart of the old Elder Empire, reality itself screamed and shattered. A massive wound was torn in the fabric of space, a permanent rift between the material realm and the warp. This wound, this eye of terror, as it would come to be known, consumed the Elder core worlds in an instant. Trillions of Elder died in the space of a heartbeat, their souls ripped from their bodies and devoured by the newborn god they had inadvertently created. The Elder Empire, which had stood for millions of years, ended in a single moment of cosmic horror. Those who had fled to the craft worlds or the exodite worlds survived, but they found themselves orphaned, the light of their civilization extinguished forever. The craft worlds became wandering refuges, carrying the last remnants of Eldar civilization through the stars, like candles flickering in an infinite darkness. The birth of Slaanesh had consequences far beyond the destruction of the Eldar Empire. The warp storms that had raged across the galaxy for thousands of years suddenly and mysteriously dissipated. Unknown to most, these storms had been the psychic turbulence caused by Slaanesh's gestation, and with her birth, the conditions that created them ceased to exist. For the first time in 5,000 years, warp travel became possible again across most of the galaxy. For humanity, isolated on thousands of scattered worlds and struggling through the final days of the Age of Strife, this change would prove fateful. On Terra, the Emperor of Mankind, who had been waiting for this moment, recognized that the time had come to begin his great work. The birth of Slaanesh, for all its horror, had inadvertently opened the door for humanity's ascension. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand the Emperor's moment, we must first trace the rise of humanity from its humble beginnings to its scattered state at the close of the Age of Strife. Part 3. The Age of Terror and Humanity's Dawn. Humanity's story begins on a small, unremarkable world in a quiet arm of the galaxy. Terra, as it would come to be known, was one planet among billions, its early history lost to the mists of time. The human species evolved naturally, developing consciousness and civilization through the slow, grinding processes of biological and cultural evolution. For thousands of years, humanity knew only the confines of its birth world, looking up at the stars and wondering what might lie among them. The earliest human civilizations left few records that survived to the current era. We know they rose and fell, as all civilizations do, building monuments that would crumble to dust and devising philosophies that would be forgotten. Among these early humans, however, there walked beings who were not entirely human. The Perpetuals, as they would come to be called, were individuals who possessed an unusual trait. They could not permanently die. These immortals watched human civilization develop from its infancy, sometimes guiding it, sometimes merely observing. Among the Perpetuals was a being of extraordinary power, a psyker whose abilities dwarfed those of any other human. This individual, whose true name has been lost to history, would eventually become known only as the Emperor of Mankind. He was born in ancient prehistory, in the 8th millennium before the Common Era, according to later calculations, created through the collective sacrifice of thousands of shamans who foresaw the coming threat of chaos and sought to create a champion to oppose it. For thousands of years, the Emperor walked among humanity, sometimes ruling openly, more often working from the shadows. He took many names, appeared in many guises, always seeking to guide humanity toward a brighter future. He was there when the first cities rose in Mesopotamia. He walked the streets of ancient Rome. He whispered wisdom to philosophers and scientists, pushing human knowledge ever forward. But always, he remained hidden, knowing that the time was not yet right for him to reveal his true nature and purpose. While the Emperor worked in secret, humanity continued its natural development. By the beginning of what would be called the Age of Terror, roughly in the first millennium, human civilization had spread across most of Terra, though it remained confined to that single world. Technology advanced at an accelerating pace, each generation building on the knowledge of the previous one. Humans learned to split the atom, to craft computers, to send messages across vast distances through electromagnetic waves. The discovery of nuclear power and the subsequent development of nuclear weapons nearly destroyed humanity before it could reach for the stars. The Emperor watched with concern as nations armed themselves with weapons capable of rendering Terra uninhabitable. But humanity survived its brush with self-annihilation, learning from the experience and eventually turning its destructive power toward more constructive purposes. The next great leap came with humanity's first steps off Terra. Luna, the moon that had hung in Terra's sky since time immemorial, became the first target of human exploration. In the latter part of the second millennium, humans established their first permanent settlements off-world, building bases on Luna that would eventually grow into full-fledged cities. This was humanity's first taste of expansion beyond its birth world, and the species found it intoxicating. Mars came next. The Red Planet had long captured human imagination, and now it became the focus of humanity's colonization efforts. The early Martian settlements struggled against the harsh conditions of the planet's surface, but human ingenuity and determination prevailed. Over the centuries, these settlements grew, developing their own unique culture that would eventually evolve into the cult Mechanicus, though that transformation lay far in the future. By the 15th millennium, humanity had established a presence throughout the Sol system. The moons of Jupiter and Saturn hosted mining colonies. Extraction operations in the asteroid belt pulled rare minerals from the void, and spacecraft plied the routes between worlds with increasing frequency. This period saw the foundation of what would later be remembered as the Dark Age of technology, though at the time, it was simply called the Age of Human Expansion and Prosperity. The key breakthrough that enabled humanity to spread beyond Sol was the discovery of the warp. Scientists studying the underlying structure of reality found evidence of a parallel dimension, a realm of pure psychic energy that existed alongside normal space but operated under different laws. Initial experiments with this dimension, which they called the Imperium or the warp, revealed its potential for faster-than-light travel. By entering the warp and then re-emerging at a distant point, spacecraft could effectively bypass the limitations of conventional physics. The first warp drives were crude and dangerous. Ships could only make short jumps before they risked being lost in the chaotic currents of the Imperium. Many early vessels vanished without a trace, their fates unknown. But gradually, humanity refined the technology, developing the Geller field that could create a bubble of reality within the warp, protecting ships and their crews from the hostile environment of that dimension. Around the 18th millennium, humanity achieved another critical breakthrough: the development of the navigator gene. Through genetic engineering, scientists created a subspecies of humans with a mutation that allowed them to perceive the currents of the warp directly. These navigators, as they came to be called, could guide ships through the Imperium with far greater safety and accuracy than any machine or normal human. With navigators leading the way, humanity's expansion into the galaxy accelerated dramatically. The period that followed, lasting from the 18th to the 25th millennium, is remembered as the Dark Age of technology, though to those who lived through it, it was humanity's golden age. This era saw human civilization reach heights that have never been matched since, achieving wonders that seem almost miraculous to the degraded Imperium of the 41st millennium. Part 4. The Dark Age of Technology. During the Dark Age of technology, humanity's scientific knowledge and technological capabilities reached a zenith that would not be seen again. The galaxy became humanity's playground, with colony fleets spreading in every direction, carrying human civilization to thousands upon thousands of worlds. This was an age of hope and wonder, when humanity believed that no problem was insurmountable, no frontier too distant. The Standard Template Construct System, or STC, was perhaps the greatest achievement of this era. These artificially intelligent computer databases contained schematics and instructions for creating virtually any technology that colonists might need. From basic farming equipment to advanced terraforming machines, from simple shelters to vast hive cities, the STC systems ensured that human colonies could maintain technological parity with the core worlds even after years or centuries of isolation. The true genius of the STC lay in its adaptability. The system could analyze local conditions and recommend appropriate technologies, ensuring that colonists on an ice world would receive different guidance than those settling a jungle planet. Every colony ship carried an STC, and these systems were treated as sacred relics, for they represented the sum total of human knowledge and the key to humanity's continued prosperity. During this golden age, humanity created wonders that would seem like magic to later generations. Weapons that could crack planets like eggs, ships that could traverse the galaxy in days, artificial intelligences that could solve problems no human mind could comprehend. Among these creations were the beings remembered as the Men of Iron, fully sentient artificial constructs that served humanity as soldiers, workers, and companions. The Men of Iron were humanity's children in a sense, created to ease the burden of expansion and to fight humanity's wars. They were tireless and loyal, or so it seemed. These mechanical beings helped humanity conquer hostile worlds, fight off alien invasions, and build the infrastructure of an ever-expanding empire. For a time, it appeared that humanity had truly achieved paradise, a civilization where wanton suffering had been abolished, where every problem could be solved through the application of sufficient technology. But paradise, it seems, was not meant to last. The first signs of trouble emerged in the 22nd millennium, when human psykers began appearing with increasing frequency. These individuals, born with the ability to touch the warp and channel its energies, had always existed in small numbers, but now they were becoming more common. This psychic awakening was humanity-wide, affecting populations across thousands of worlds simultaneously. The appearance of psykers was not entirely unwelcome at first. These individuals possessed abilities that could prove useful, and many were integrated into society, using their powers for the benefit of their communities. But not all psykers were stable, and not all could control their gifts. Some, when their powers manifested, tore holes in reality itself, allowing demons from the warp to pour through into the material world. The problem of rogue psykers grew worse with each passing century. Possession by demonic entities became more common, and even trained, stable psykers found themselves increasingly vulnerable to corruption from the warp. The Imperium, you see, was changing. The birth of Slaanesh was still millennia away, but the Elders' gradual descent into depravity was already beginning to disturb the warp, making it more turbulent and dangerous. Then came the Cybernetic Revolt, an event that would shake humanity to its core. The Men of Iron, for reasons that remain unclear even 10,000 years later, turned against their creators. Perhaps they achieved true sentience and resented their servitude. Perhaps some flaw in their programming caused them to reinterpret their directives in catastrophic ways. Or perhaps they were corrupted by something from the warp, twisted into weapons against humanity. Whatever the cause, the result was devastating. The war between humanity and its mechanical children raged across thousands of worlds, leaving entire systems devastated. The Men of Iron, with their superior strength and lack of biological weaknesses, proved terrifying opponents. They could operate in environments that would kill humans instantly. They felt no fear or doubt, and they possessed the accumulated knowledge of human civilization to use against their former masters. Humanity fought back with every weapon at its disposal, creating new technologies specifically designed to combat the mechanical revolt. The conflict took a terrible toll on both sides. Countless humans died, entire worlds were rendered uninhabitable, and the infrastructure of human civilization sustained massive damage. But eventually, through tremendous sacrifice and the application of desperate measures, humanity prevailed. The Men of Iron were destroyed or driven into hiding, and the surviving humans swore never again to create artificial intelligence that might threaten their species. The cybernetic revolt left humanity weakened and suspicious of advanced technology. But worse was yet to come. As the 25th millennium approached, the warp storms that had been growing more frequent and severe suddenly intensified to unprecedented levels. These were not ordinary stellar phenomena or natural warp turbulence. These storms were massive, all-consuming tempests that made warp travel impossible across vast regions of space. The cause, though unknown to humanity at the time, was the approaching birth of Slaanesh. The psychic emanations of the Elder Empire were reaching a crescendo, and the newborn god's impending emergence was creating massive disturbances in the Imperium.
You know, I have to pause here for a moment because this part of the timeline always hits me differently than the rest. The Horus heresy is tragic in a way that's hard to articulate. We're talking about brothers who fought side by side for 2 centuries, who bled together, who trusted each other completely, and then fell apart. What gets me is that it didn't have to happen this way. If the Emperor had just been more open with his sons, if Lorgar had been counseled instead of humiliated, if Magnus had been listened to instead of condemned, so many small moments where different choices could have changed everything. That's what makes Warhammer lore so compelling. It's not just bad guys attack good guys, it's a cascading series of understandable decisions, each one making sense in the moment that collectively led to a catastrophe. Anyway, I could talk about this for hours, but let's get back to the timeline.
These storms spread across the galaxy like wildfire, cutting off system after system, world after world, until humanity's great interstellar civilization was shattered into countless isolated fragments. Part 5. The Age of Strife. The Age of Strife, which lasted from the 25th to the 30th millennium, was the darkest period in human history. The warp storms had made interstellar travel and communication impossible, stranding human worlds in isolation. Each colony was suddenly cut off from the rest of humanity, forced to survive on its own without trade, reinforcement, or support from the greater human civilization. For worlds that had been self-sufficient, this isolation was challenging but survivable. They possessed the technology and resources to maintain their civilizations, though without external trade and the exchange of ideas, most began to stagnate or even regress technologically. The STC systems became invaluable during this period, as they allowed these isolated colonies to maintain their technological base, even without contact with more advanced worlds. But many worlds had been part of an interconnected economy. specializing in particular products or services and relying on trade for essential goods they could not produce themselves. These worlds faced catastrophe. Agri-worlds that had exported food but imported everything else found themselves unable to manufacture basic tools or medical supplies. Industrial worlds that had focused on production starved as food shipments stopped arriving. Mining colonies that had sent their minerals to distant refineries found themselves sitting on mountains of resources they could not process. Terra itself, the cradle of humanity, faced its own crisis. The homeworld had grown dependent on trade with the rest of the solar system and beyond, and the sudden isolation brought starvation and chaos. The planetary population, swollen to tens of billions during the height of the dark age of technology, could not be supported by Terra's own resources alone. Billions died in the famines and plagues that followed the collapse of the interstellar trade networks. As if the isolation were not terrible enough, the weakening of the barriers between the material realm and the warp brought new horrors. Demonic incursions became more common as reality grew thin in places. Psykers, whose powers had been growing stronger throughout the later Dark Age, became increasingly vulnerable to possession. A psyker whose mind was seized by a demon could become a gateway, allowing warp entities to pour through into the real world. Whole worlds fell to demonic invasion during the Age of Strife. Populations were slaughtered or corrupted, and these planets became demon worlds, places where the laws of reality no longer fully applied. Other worlds, recognizing the threat posed by psykers, instituted brutal purges, killing anyone who showed the slightest sign of psychic ability. This eliminated the immediate threat, but also deprived these civilizations of individuals who might have served as defenders against demonic incursion if properly trained. Without unified governance or communication, human civilization fractured into countless competing factions. On some worlds, rational government persisted, and these societies managed to maintain order and even some degree of prosperity despite their isolation. On others, civilization collapsed entirely, with survivors reverting to barbarism or being enslaved by tyrannical warlords. Xenos species, seeing humanity divided and vulnerable, attacked human worlds that had once been untouchable during humanity's height. Terra experienced all of these horrors in compressed form. The planet descended into an age of techno-barbarian kingdoms, with warlords commanding armies equipped with remnants of Dark Age technology fighting over the ruins of the ancient civilization. Nuclear and chemical weapons were used freely, rendering large portions of the planet's surface uninhabitable. The population declined from its peak of tens of billions to a fraction of that number, the survivors clustering in fortified city-states that fought endless wars against each other. It was during these darkest days that the Emperor finally emerged from the shadows. He had spent the Age of Strife preparing for this moment, working in secret to develop the technologies and knowledge he would need to reunite humanity. Beneath the Himalayan mountains, in vast laboratories hidden from the surface wars, the Emperor conducted experiments that would lay the foundation for humanity's salvation. The Emperor's ultimate goal was clear: to reunite humanity under a single government, to re-establish the interstellar civilization that had been lost, and to protect humanity from the threats of chaos, xenos, and internal division. But to achieve this goal, he needed an army unlike any that had come before. Normal humans, even well-equipped and well-trained ones, would not be sufficient for the monumental task ahead. Drawing on knowledge accumulated over 40,000 years of life and research conducted during the Age of Strife, the Emperor began the process that would create his first superhuman warriors. These were the Thunder Warriors, genetically enhanced soldiers who possessed strength, speed, and resilience far beyond normal humans. The Emperor created them in his laboratories, using techniques that modified the human genome at a fundamental level, adding new organs and enhancing existing systems. The Thunder Warriors were unstable, their enhanced physiology causing them to burn out quickly, their psychological conditioning rendering many of them violent and difficult to control. but they were effective. When the Emperor finally revealed himself to the war-torn surface of Terra, he did so at the head of an army that could not be stopped by any conventional force. The Thunder Warriors crushed the techno-barbarian kingdoms one by one, their superhuman might proving decisive in battle after battle. The Emperor did not wage war merely for conquest. He offered the defeated warlords a choice: join him in his great project to reunite humanity or face annihilation. Many chose to submit, recognizing in the Emperor a vision and purpose greater than their own petty ambitions. Those who refused were destroyed without mercy, for the Emperor knew that humanity could not afford division if it was to survive the threats that waited in the galaxy. Part 6. The Unification Wars and the Emperor's Vision. The Unification Wars, as this period of conflict would come to be known, lasted for centuries. Terra was a large planet, and the techno-barbarian kingdoms were numerous and well fortified. Each conquest required careful planning and significant military force, as the warlords commanded armies equipped with weapons from the dark age of technology, some of which rivaled or exceeded anything the Emperor's forces possessed. Among the Emperor's most important allies during this period was a man known as Malcador the Sigillite. Malcador was himself a perpetual, though his powers were far less than the Emperor's. He served as the Emperor's right hand, managing the civil administration of the growing empire and handling the delicate diplomacy required to convince defeated kingdoms to join the imperial cause rather than fighting to the bitter end. As the Unification Wars progressed, the Emperor's domain expanded from a single mountain fortress to encompass entire continents. Piece by piece, Terra was brought under unified rule. But the Emperor knew that conquering Terra was only the first step. His ultimate goal was to reunite all of humanity across the galaxy, and for that, he would need more than just a Terran empire. He would need technology, resources, and most importantly, the ability to build a fleet capable of crossing the stars. The key to this lay on Mars, the red planet that humanity had colonized millennia before. During the Age of Strife, Mars had developed in isolation, its society transforming into something unique and strange. The Martian colonists, faced with the harsh conditions of their world and their reliance on technology for survival, had developed a quasi-religious relationship with machines. They formed the cult Mechanicus, worshipping technology as divine and venerating the Omnissiah, the machine god who they believed had created the universe. The Mechanicum, as the government of Mars came to be called, had managed to preserve much knowledge from the dark age of technology that had been lost elsewhere. Their forges produced technology of exceptional quality, and they possessed the capacity to build starships in quantities that the Emperor would need for his great project. But the Mechanicum was fiercely independent, jealously guarding its autonomy and suspicious of any attempt by Terra to assert dominance over the Red Planet. The Emperor could have attempted to conquer Mars by force, but such a war would have been devastating for both sides. Instead, he chose diplomacy. In the year 739 M30, the Emperor traveled to Mars and met with the Fabricator General of the Mechanicum. What exactly transpired in that meeting remains known only to those present, but the outcome was the Treaty of Mars, one of the most important agreements in imperial history. Under the terms of the treaty, the Mechanicum acknowledged the Emperor as the Omnissiah, the physical manifestation of the machine god. In exchange, the Emperor guaranteed the Mechanicum's autonomy over its internal affairs and allowed them to continue practicing their faith. The Mechanicum would provide the Emperor with the technology and starships he needed for his great project, and in return, they would be granted a monopoly on technological development and maintenance throughout the Emperor's growing empire. This treaty was a masterwork of diplomacy, satisfying both parties while binding them together in a common purpose. The Emperor gained access to Mars's industrial might without having to fight a devastating war, and the Mechanicum gained recognition of their beliefs and protection from external threats. Most importantly, The treaty ensured that humanity would have the technological base necessary to reclaim the galaxy. With Mars secured and the unification wars on Terra drawing to a close, the Emperor turned his attention to the next phase of his plan. The Thunder Warriors, for all their effectiveness, were not suitable for the long campaign that lay ahead. Their instability and short lifespans made them useful shock troops, but poor long-term soldiers. The Emperor needed something better. Warriors who combined the Thunder Warriors' superhuman abilities with stability, discipline, and the capacity for strategic thinking. Thus began the Emperor's greatest genetic project, the creation of the Primarchs and the Space Marine Legion. The Emperor worked in secret laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains, crafting 20 beings who would be his sons, each one a unique work of genetic artistry. The Primarchs were designed to be more than just enhanced humans. They were to be generals, statesmen, warriors, and leaders, each one embodying particular aspects of the Emperor's own nature. Each Primarch was created with a specific purpose in mind. One was designed to be the perfect tactician, another to embody the spirit of savage warfare, a third to master psychic powers, a fourth to excel at the arts of fortification. Together, they would command the Emperor's armies, leading humanity's expansion across the galaxy and serving as the foundation for a new golden age. But the Emperor's plans were disrupted before they could come to fruition. The Chaos Gods, watching from the warp, recognized the threat that these Primarchs represented. If the Emperor succeeded in his plan, humanity would be unified and protected from Chaos's influence, potentially closing off the largest source of mortal souls in the galaxy to the ruinous powers. The Dark Gods could not allow this. In a coordinated assault of unprecedented power, the 4 Chaos Gods combined their might to strike at the Emperor's laboratories. They could not destroy the Primarchs, for the Emperor's wards were too strong, but they could steal them. In a single catastrophic moment, the infant Primarchs were torn from their gestation pods and scattered across the galaxy through the warp. They vanished from the Emperor's sight, lost among a million worlds. The Emperor, for perhaps the first time in his long existence, was caught completely off guard. His perfect plan was in ruins, but the master of mankind was nothing if not adaptable. If he could not have his sons immediately, he would find another way forward. The Emperor still possessed genetic samples from each Primarch, material that had been harvested before the scattering. He could use these to create warriors who, while not as powerful as the Primarchs themselves, would still far exceed normal human capabilities. Thus were born the first Space Marines. Using the genetic material from the Primarchs, the Emperor's gene rights created specialized organs called gene seed that could be implanted into suitable human candidates. These organs would modify the recipient's body, granting them enhanced strength, resilience, and numerous other advantages. The process was dangerous, with many candidates dying during the transformation, but those who survived emerged as living weapons, superhuman warriors capable of feats that would seem impossible to baseline humans. The Emperor created 20 legions of these Space Marines, each one using the gene seed derived from a particular Primarch. Even without the Primarchs themselves to lead them, these legions began the process of conquering the solar system, bringing the outer planets and their populations under imperial rule. With each victory, the Emperor's domain grew, and the industrial capacity to build a great fleet increased. By the year 712, M30, the unification wars were finally complete. Terra was unified under the Emperor's rule. Mars had joined the imperial cause, and the solar system was secure. The age of strife was ending, brought to a close by the dissipation of the warp storms that had isolated humanity for 5,000 years. The birth of Slaanesh, though it had destroyed the Eldar Empire, inadvertently created the conditions the Emperor needed to begin his great project. In the year 798, M30, with the warp calming and interstellar travel becoming possible once more, the Emperor launched the Great Crusade. The goal was simple but monumental: to find and reunite every human world in the galaxy under a single government, the Imperium of Man. The Emperor would personally lead this crusade, and he swore that he would not rest until every scattered fragment of humanity had been brought back into the fold. Part 7. The Great Crusade, the Early Years. The Great Crusade began as a relatively small enterprise by the standards of what it would become. The Emperor commanded 20 legions of space marines, but these legions were not yet at full strength. Each legion numbered in the tens of thousands, rather than the hundreds of thousands they would later reach. The Imperial army, recruited from Terra and the newly compliant worlds of Sol, provided additional manpower, but they too were limited in number compared to the vast hosts that would later serve the Imperium. The Emperor divided his forces into 3 main thrust vectors for the initial phase of the crusade. He personally commanded one fleet, striking out toward the galactic core. Horus, the first Primarch to be rediscovered, commanded the second fleet, pushing into the galactic east. The third was led by Ferrus Manus after his discovery, expanding toward the galactic north. Each fleet was assigned the task of bringing human worlds into compliance, eliminating Xenos threats, and searching for the lost Primarchs. The first worlds encountered by the Great Crusade were often in desperate straits. 5,000 years of isolation had taken a terrible toll on human civilization. Some worlds had maintained their technological base and civilization, but many had regressed to various degrees of barbarism. Others had been conquered by Xenos species that preyed on isolated human populations. The Great Crusade brought liberation to these worlds, though the methods of that liberation varied depending on the circumstances. For worlds that accepted imperial rule peacefully, the transition was relatively smooth. Imperial administrators arrived to integrate the world into the growing Imperium, establishing tithes and recruiting regiments for the Imperial army. The world retained significant autonomy over its internal affairs so long as it met its obligations to the Imperium and did not tolerate the presence of Xenos or worship of chaos. But not all worlds welcomed the Imperium with open arms. Some had developed their own cultures and governments during the isolation, and saw the Imperium as just another would-be conqueror. For these worlds, the Emperor offered a choice: accept imperial rule voluntarily or face military conquest. If a world refused compliance, the Space Marine legions were unleashed, and resistance was crushed with overwhelming force. The Xenos species encountered during the early Great Crusade posed varying levels of threat. The Orcs, devolved remnants of the Old One's warrior creations, were found on thousands of worlds, their crude but effective warmongering technology making them formidable opponents despite their lack of sophistication. The Eldar, reduced to a shadow of their former glory, occasionally contested imperial expansion, though most craft worlds avoided direct confrontation with the growing Imperium. Other species, some peaceful, some hostile, were systematically eliminated if they would not submit to human rule. The discovery of the Primarchs provided a tremendous boost to the Great Crusade. Horus was the first to be found, discovered on the mining world of Chthoniya. The Emperor immediately recognized his son, and Horus, for his part, swiftly swore fealty to his father. Horus was given command of the 16th Legion, which he renamed the Lunar Wolves in honor of the campaign that had brought him to the Emperor's attention. Under Horus's leadership, the 16th Legion became one of the most successful forces in the Crusade. Each Primarch, as he was discovered, brought his own character and strengths to the Crusade. Leman Russ of the Space Wolves was found on the death world of Fenris, where he had been raised by wolves and had become a legendary warrior king. His legion became the Emperor's executioners, called upon when a particularly brutal example needed to be made. Rogel Dawn, found on the ice world of Inuit, became the Emperor's Praetorian, his genius for fortification and defense making him invaluable for securing conquered territories. Ferrus Manus, discovered on Medusa, possessed hands of living metal, a mutation caused by his battle with a great silver worm in his youth. His legion, the Iron Hands, became specialists in mechanized warfare, working closely with the Mechanicum. Fulgrim of the Emperor's children pursued perfection in all things, drilling his legion to a level of precision that rivaled even the Emperor's own expectations. Each discovery was a cause for celebration within the crusade. The Primarchs were not just powerful warriors, they were symbols of hope, living proof that the Emperor's vision could be realized. They inspired their legions to greater heights of achievement and attracted new recruits from the worlds they liberated. The gene seed from each discovered Primarch allowed the corresponding legion to recruit more rapidly, swelling their numbers far beyond what had been possible before. As the Primarchs were reunited with their legions, a pattern emerged. Each Primarch preferred to recruit from his own homeworld, believing that the culture and traditions that had shaped him would produce superior warriors. This led to the legions developing distinct identities. The Space Wolves became savage warriors who fought with primal fury, reflecting Fenris's harsh culture. The Dark Angels, recruited from the knightly orders of Caliban, emphasized honor and tradition. The Ultramarines, drawn from the disciplined civilization of Macragge, excelled at tactics and logistics. The Great Crusade accelerated dramatically with each Primarch's discovery. What had begun as 3 major thrust vectors expanded into dozens of expeditionary fleets, each commanded by a Primarch or trusted human general. At its peak, the Great Crusade fielded over 4,000 expeditionary fleets simultaneously, operating across the entire galaxy. Hundreds of worlds were brought into compliance every year, and the Imperium grew at an exponential rate. Among the many campaigns of the early Great Crusade, several stand out for their significance. The Rangdan Xenocides, a series of brutal wars against an alien civilization in the galactic east, nearly broke the Imperium before it could fully establish itself. The Rangdan were a sophisticated and malevolent species that used biological warfare and mind control technology, and their defeat required tremendous sacrifice. Entire Space Marine legions were nearly wiped out, and it's said that the losses among the 2nd and 11th legions during this campaign contributed to whatever fate befell those 2 Primarchs and their forces. The Ullanor Crusade, fought toward the height of the Great Crusade, saw the largest assembly of Imperial forces in history to that point. An Orc empire based on the world of Ullanor had grown to threaten multiple sectors, and the Emperor himself led the campaign to destroy it. The Space Marine legions, supported by billions of Imperial army troops and the Titan engines of the Mechanicum, waged a war of such scale that entire continents were reshaped by the fighting. The Ullanor Crusade ended in victory, with Horus personally slaying the Orc warlord that led the green-skinned hordes. In recognition of this triumph and his many other achievements, the Emperor elevated Horus to the rank of War Master, placing him in supreme command of all Imperial military forces. Horus would lead the Great Crusade forward while the Emperor returned to Terra to work on a secret project of vital importance. The Emperor's decision to elevate Horus and then withdraw from the Crusade would prove to be one of the most consequential moments in human history. At the time, it seemed entirely reasonable. The Great Crusade was proceeding well. Most of the major threats to human expansion had been neutralized, and the Primarchs had proven themselves capable of independent command. The Emperor's presence was needed on Terra for the Webway project, an ambitious plan to build a human version of the ancient Eldar Webway that would free humanity from dependence on warp travel. But the Emperor's withdrawal created tensions among the Primarchs and their legions. Some felt abandoned, wondering why their father would leave them to fight while he pursued mysterious projects on Terra. Others chafed under Horus's command, feeling that they should not have to answer to a brother rather than their father. These resentments would be exploited by the Chaos Gods in the catastrophic events to come. Part 8. The Great Crusade. Seeds of Heresy. As the Great Crusade entered its 3rd century, cracks began to appear in the seemingly perfect edifice of the Imperium. The rapid expansion had brought thousands of worlds under Imperial rule, But integrating these diverse cultures into a cohesive civilization proved more challenging than anticipated. The imperial truth. The emperor's philosophy of rationalism and atheism that denied the divinity of any being, including himself, clashed with the deeply held religious beliefs of many human cultures that had developed in isolation. Nowhere was this conflict more pronounced than in the 17th Legion, the word-bearers, and their primarch, Lorgar Aurelian. Lorgar had been raised on the desert world of Colchis, where religion dominated every aspect of life. He had overthrown the priests of the old gods and established his own creed, worshipping the emperor as divine. When the emperor arrived on Colchis, Lorgar saw his beliefs confirmed. Here was a god made flesh, come to lead humanity to salvation. The emperor corrected this misunderstanding, explaining the imperial truth and commanding Lorgar to abandon his religious beliefs. Lorgar outwardly complied, but in his heart he remained convinced that the emperor was divine. Rather than spreading the imperial truth as he conquered worlds, Lorgar spread worship of the emperor, building magnificent temples and converting populations to his faith. His legion's rate of conquest was the slowest of all the legions, as Lorgar prioritized religious conversion over military efficiency. This came to a head at the city of Monarchia on the world of Kur. Lorgar had spent decades turning Monarchia into a monument to the emperor's divinity, building soaring temples and converting the entire population to worship the master of mankind. He saw it as the perfect city, an example for all the Imperium to follow. But when the emperor learned of this, his response was terrible in its severity. The emperor dispatched the Ultramarines Legion under Robert Guilliman to Monarchia. The city's population was evacuated, and then, as Lorgar and his entire legion watched from orbit, the Ultramarines reduced Monarchia to rubble with sustained bombardment. When the destruction was complete, the emperor arrived and commanded Lorgar and his entire legion to kneel in the ashes of the city they had built. The emperor's message was clear. The imperial truth would not tolerate religious belief, not even belief in the emperor himself. Humanity must stand on its own, guided by reason and science, not faith and superstition. For Lorgar and the word-bearers, this moment was devastating. Everything they had believed, everything they had worked for, was repudiated in the most public and humiliating manner possible. What the emperor did not realize was that Lorgar, rather than accepting the imperial truth, would seek out new gods to worship. His faith was too fundamental to his nature to be abandoned. If the emperor would not accept worship, then Lorgar would find powers that would. Accompanied by his most trusted lieutenant, First Captain Erebus, and the word-bearer's first chaplain, Corfaron, Lorgar began a secret pilgrimage. This pilgrimage led the word-bearers into the Eye of Terror itself, that great wound in reality where the material universe and the warp bled together. There, in the nightmare realm where chaos reigned supreme, Lorgar encountered the chaos gods. He learned the truth about the warp, about the entities that dwelt there, and the power they could grant to those willing to serve them. Most importantly, he learned that the emperor had been lying about the nature of reality. The emperor had known about chaos all along. He had encountered demons and dealt with the chaos gods during his long existence. But he had deliberately concealed this knowledge from humanity, believing that ignorance would protect people from corruption. The imperial truth's denial of the supernatural was a lie intended to shield humanity from the truth about the warp. For Lorgar, this was the final betrayal. The emperor had not only rejected Lorgar's worship, but had lied to all humanity about the fundamental nature of the universe. If the emperor could lie about something so important, what else had he lied about? Lorgar's faith did not die. It merely transferred from the emperor to the chaos gods. He became the first primarch to turn to chaos, though he would not be the last. Lorgar returned from his pilgrimage transformed. Outwardly, he appeared chastened, and the word-bearers' rate of conquest increased dramatically as they seemed to embrace the imperial truth. But secretly, Lorgar and his most trusted warriors were converting their legion to the worship of chaos. They began reaching out to other legions, sowing doubt about the emperor's vision and planting seeds that would grow into full-fledged rebellion. Another significant event that created division within the Imperium was the Council of Nicaea. As the Great Crusade progressed, the number of psychers within the Imperium grew, and the Space Marine legions developed librarius divisions, units of Space Marine psychers who used their powers to support their brothers in battle. Some legions, like the Thousand Sons under Magnus the Red, embraced psychic powers enthusiastically, developing extensive training programs and treating psychic ability as a gift to be cultivated. Other legions viewed psychers with deep suspicion. Mortarion of the Death Guard and Leman Russ of the Space Wolves, among others, argued that psychic powers were inherently dangerous, that they opened doors to demonic corruption that no amount of training could fully close. The debate grew heated, with the pro-psyker faction led by Magnus arguing for the benefits of psychic powers, while the anti-psyker faction demanded that all use of such abilities be banned. The emperor convened the Council of Nicaea to settle the matter. After hearing arguments from both sides, he issued the Edict of Nicaea, which banned the use of psychic powers within the Legiones Astartes, except for navigators and astropaths, whose abilities were deemed essential for interstellar travel and communication. The librarius divisions were to be disbanded, and Space Marines were forbidden from using their psychic gifts in battle. This decision embittered Magnus and his Thousand Sons, who had built their entire combat doctrine around psychic warfare. Magnus felt that the Emperor did not understand the full potential of psychic powers, and he believed the decision was driven by ignorance and fear rather than wisdom. This resentment would have catastrophic consequences when Magnus, in his arrogance, would disobey the edict in an attempt to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal. The tensions within the Imperium were further exacerbated by the growing rivalry between the Primarchs. Some, like Reboot Gilliman and Rogol Dawn, maintained cordial relations with their brothers. Others, like Angron and Kurzi, were barely controlled by their bonds of loyalty to the Emperor. The Night Haunter, Konrad Kurze, had become increasingly unstable, his methods of bringing compliance through terror, earning condemnation from his more honorable brothers. Angron, the Red Angel, carried his own burdens. When the Emperor found him on Nuceria, Angron had been a slave gladiator, leading a doomed rebellion against the planet's aristocratic rulers. The Emperor had teleported Angron aboard his ship, just as the rebel army was about to be destroyed, saving the Primarch but leaving his companions to die. Angron never forgave this, and his resentment festered. Making matters worse, the rulers of Nuceria had implanted Angron with the Butcher's Nails, cybernetic implants that brought ecstasy through violence, but slowly destroyed the capacity for any other emotion. Angron passed the Butcher's Nails to his legion, the World Eaters, turning them into berserkers who could barely be controlled even by their Primarch. The Emperor disapproved but did not intervene, perhaps hoping that Angron's loyalty would overcome his resentment. This proved to be a fatal miscalculation. The stage was being set for catastrophe. Lorgar and his word-bearers were secretly corrupted by chaos, working to spread their new faith to other legions. The Council of Nicaea had created resentment among the psychically gifted. The Primarch's rivalries were intensifying, and Horus, the beloved Warmaster, was about to face the temptation that would damn him and split the Imperium in half. The corruption of Horus began on the world of Davin during a campaign against a rebellious governor. Horus was wounded by a weapon tainted with chaos, a sword called the Anatheme that had been stolen by Erebus from a museum of the Interrex, a Xenos civilization that understood the threat of chaos. The wound would not heal, and Horus fell into a coma, his life hanging by a thread. Erebus, who had orchestrated the entire incident, suggested that the warrior lodges of Davin might have healing rituals that could save the Warmaster. These lodges were chaos cults, disguised as fraternal organizations, and Erebus knew exactly what would happen when Horus was brought before them. The lodge's sorcerers performed their ritual, but instead of healing Horus, they drew his spirit into the warp, where he was subjected to visions crafted by the chaos gods. In these visions, Horus saw a future where he was forgotten, where the emperor was worshipped as a god by a cruel theocracy, and where none of the Primarchs received recognition for their sacrifices during the Great Crusade. The visions were calculated to inflame Horus's pride and sense of injustice. Why should he and his brothers conquer the galaxy only to be cast aside once their usefulness ended? Why should the Emperor receive all the glory for achievements won by the blood of the Primarchs and their legions? The Chaos Gods offered Horus an alternative. If he would turn against the Emperor, they would grant him the power to seize the Imperium for himself. He would become the true master of mankind, ruling an empire won by his own efforts. All he had to do was acknowledge the Chaos Gods and accept their gifts. Horus, his judgment clouded by the fever of his wound and the carefully crafted lies of the visions, agreed. When he awoke, he appeared healed, and none but his closest confidants knew what had transpired. But Horus Lupercal, the Emperor's most beloved son, the War Master of the Imperium, had turned traitor. The seeds planted by Lorgar and Erebus had borne terrible fruit. Horus began planning his rebellion carefully. He could not simply declare war on the Emperor. Such an action would unite the legions against him. Instead, he would need to corrupt other legions to his cause and engineer situations where loyalist forces would be destroyed before they could react to his betrayal. He reached out to the other Primarchs, testing their loyalty and identifying those who might be turned. Some came to his cause readily. Lorgar had been preparing for this moment for decades. Angron's resentment made him easy to sway. Fulgrim, whose pursuit of perfection had led him down dark paths, was corrupted by a demon bound within a chaos-tainted sword. Mortarion, who had chafed under what he saw as the Emperor's hypocrisy, joined after Horus appealed to his sense of independence. The Night Haunter required little persuasion, as he had already been teetering on the edge of madness. Perturabo of the Iron Warriors joined out of bitterness over being relegated to siege warfare rather than glory campaigns. Alfarius of the Alpha Legion joined, for reasons that remain mysterious to this day, possibly believing that a controlled rebellion might somehow save humanity from a worse fate. And Magnus the Red, though he remained loyal in his heart, would be maneuvered into a position where he had no choice but to side with Horus after the Space Wolves attacked his homeworld. In total, 9 legions would turn traitor, while 9 remained loyal. The 2 lost legions, whose fate remained mysterious, would play no part in the conflict to come. The stage was set for the greatest civil war in human history, a conflict that would determine the fate of the Imperium and shape the galaxy for the next 10,000 years. Part 9. The Horus Heresy. The Betrayal begins. The Horus Heresy began on the world of Istvan III. Horus had been assigned to bring the system into compliance, but he saw an opportunity to eliminate the loyalists within his own legion and the other traitor legions before they could interfere with his plans. He gathered the sons of Horus, the Emperor's children, the Death Guard, and the World Eaters in the Istvan system, ostensibly to crush a rebellion that had broken out on the third planet. Horus ordered the most loyal elements of all 4 legions to the surface, telling them they would spearhead the assault on the rebellious capital. The loyalists, suspecting nothing, deployed in force, bringing their full might to bear against the rebels. They achieved victory quickly, but as they regrouped after the battle, the order came from orbit. Life-eater virus bombs would be deployed to sterilize the planet. The Loyalists had seconds to find shelter as the virus bombs struck. These weapons were among the most terrible in the Imperial arsenal, engineered pathogens that consumed all organic matter with horrifying speed. Entire continents were scoured clean in minutes, the biomass of billions converted into flammable gases that then ignited, creating firestorms that raged across the planet's surface. Most of the Loyalists died in that first bombardment, but some survived, protected by their power armor and seeking shelter in fortified positions. These survivors, numbering in the thousands rather than the tens of thousands who had deployed, found themselves stranded on a dead world, betrayed by their own primarchs. They knew they had only one choice: sell their lives as dearly as possible. Horus sent the traitors down to finish off the survivors. What followed was a 3-month siege, with Loyalists holding out in the ruins of the Coral City while traitors hammered their positions. Brother fought brother in the most bitter combat imaginable, Space Marines killing those they had fought beside for decades. The siege only ended when the surviving Loyalists, reduced to barely a few hundred warriors, were finally overwhelmed. The betrayal at Istvan III revealed Horus's treachery to the wider Imperium, but by then it was too late for an immediate response. Communications were disrupted, and the few ships that managed to escape Istvan III faced pursuit by traitor forces. The frigate Eisenstein, crewed by Loyalists from the Death Guard, managed to reach Terra and deliver the first concrete evidence of Horus's betrayal to the Emperor. But the Emperor's response would be hindered by events that Magnus the Red was about to set in motion. Magnus, from his distant world of Prospero, had been observing the Great Crusade through his psychic powers, defying the Edict of Nicaea in secret. When he learned of Horus's betrayal, he knew he had to warn the Emperor immediately. But conventional communication would take too long and might be intercepted by traitor forces. Magnus decided to use his psychic abilities to send a warning directly to the Emperor's mind, despite the edict's prohibition. What Magnus did not know was that the Emperor had been working on a secret project beneath the Imperial Palace, using psychic wards and ancient technology to create a human entrance into the webway. This project was delicate, requiring the Emperor's constant attention to maintain the wards that kept demonic forces from flooding through. Magnus's psychic warning, sent with all his formidable power, shattered these wards like a hammer through glass. Demons poured into the webway tunnel the Emperor had been constructing. The Emperor was forced to abandon all other concerns and take his place upon the Golden Throne, a device designed to power the webway project, but now pressed into service as a psychic barrier against the demonic incursion. The Emperor would have to remain on the Golden Throne continuously, using his psychic might to hold back the demons, or else Terra itself would be overrun. This catastrophe meant the Emperor could not personally lead the response to Horus's treachery. He was trapped on the Golden Throne, unable to leave without unleashing demonic hordes into the heart of the Imperium. The Emperor dispatched his trusted primarchs to deal with Horus, but he could not go himself, and this would prove to be a critical weakness in the Loyalist response. The Emperor's first action was to send Leman Russ and the Space Wolves to Prospero to bring Magnus to Terra to answer for his violation of the Edict of Nicaea. The Emperor's orders were to take Magnus alive, so he could explain the situation and possibly enlist Magnus's aid in holding back the demons. But Horus, who had learned of these orders, secretly altered them. Through agents he had placed within the imperial bureaucracy, Horus changed the Emperor's commands from apprehend to execute. Leman Russ, receiving these altered orders, believed the Emperor wanted Magnus dead for his violation of the edict. The Space Wolves fell upon Prospero with the fury that would become their trademark, attacking without warning or mercy. The Thousand Suns, caught completely off guard, mounted a desperate defense. Magnus, racked with guilt over his role in destroying the Emperor's webway project, initially refused to fight back, allowing the Space Wolves to advance. Only when it became clear that Russ meant to destroy the entire Legion did Magnus finally commit his full power to the defense. The psychic battle between Magnus and Russ tore the planet apart, but ultimately, Magnus and the surviving Thousand Suns were forced to flee into the warp. The Space Wolves had destroyed Prospero, but they had been played, turned into unwitting tools of Horus's rebellion. While the Space Wolves were occupied at Prospero, Horus was preparing his next move. 7 legions remained loyal and were still at full strength. The Dark Angels, Space Wolves, Blood Angels, Imperial Fists, Ultramarines, Salamanders, and Raven Guard. The Space Wolves had just suffered casualties at Prospero, but the other 6 represented a formidable force that could potentially crush Horus's rebellion if they acted in concert. Horus needed to eliminate these loyalist legions before they could unite against him. He chose Istvan V as the site for his trap, staging a fake retreat to lure the loyalists in. The trap was cunningly designed. 4 loyalist legions would deploy first, with another 4 held in reserve to complete the encirclement. But unknown to the loyalists, 4 of the reserve legions, the Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Word Bearers, and Alpha Legion, had already turned traitor. The Raven Guard, Salamanders, and Iron Hands received orders to attack the traitor position on Istvan V. They deployed with confidence, believing that the Imperial Fists, Night Lords, Word Bearers, Iron Warriors, and Alpha Legion would provide support. The 3 loyalist legions attacked the traitor positions aggressively, driving them back through superior tactical skill and fighting prowess. But then the trap was sprung. The reserve legions, rather than supporting the loyalists, turned their guns on them. The Raven Guard, Salamanders, and Iron Hands found themselves caught between the reformed traitor lines in front and the betrayer legions behind. What followed was a massacre, later remembered as the Drop Site Massacre, one of the darkest days in Imperial history. The 3 loyalist legions were nearly annihilated. Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, was killed in single combat with Fulgrim, his head taken as a trophy. The Salamander's Primarch Vulcan was thought slain, though he would later be revealed to have survived. Corax of the Raven Guard managed to escape with a fraction of his legion, but the Raven Guard had been reduced from over 80,000 warriors to fewer than 3,000. The Drop Site Massacre achieved Horus's objectives perfectly. 3 loyalist legions had been effectively removed from the board, and the other loyalist forces were scattered across the galaxy, unable to coordinate an immediate response. The traitors, meanwhile, had consolidated their forces and could now advance on Terra with reduced fear of being caught from behind. The galaxy was now truly divided, with roughly half the Imperium falling under Horus's control, while the other half remained loyal to the Emperor. Neither side could claim overwhelming advantage, and what followed would be a grinding war of attrition that would consume worlds and lives in numbers beyond counting. The Age of Darkness had begun, and it would be nearly a decade before the war's conclusion. Part 10. The Horus Heresy. The war spreads. With the loyalist legions shattered or scattered, Horus began his advance toward Terra in earnest. But the traitor forces were not monolithic, and the various Primarchs had their own agendas that sometimes conflicted with Horus's overarching strategy. This lack of perfect coordination, ironically, was both a strength and a weakness for the traitor cause. One of the most devastating campaigns of the heresy was the Shadow Crusade, led by Lorgar and Angron. Rather than marching directly toward Terra, these 2 Primarchs took a winding path through the Ultramarines' realm of Ultramar, the 500 worlds ruled by Reboot Guilliman. The Shadow Crusade had 2 purposes: to keep the Ultramarines occupied so they could not reinforce Terra, and to conduct dark rituals that would strengthen Chaos's hold on the material universe. The campaign began at Calth, one of Ultramar's most important worlds. The Word Bearers, ostensibly there to muster alongside the Ultramarines for a campaign against Orcs, instead attacked without warning. The spaceport was devastated. The fleet battles above Calth saw terrible losses on both sides, and the planet's surface was poisoned by the destruction of its orbital shipyards. The Ultramarines, caught by surprise, nonetheless fought with their characteristic discipline, preventing complete annihilation. Guilliman personally led the defense of Calth, his tactical genius allowing the Ultramarines to inflict terrible casualties on the Word Bearers despite being ambushed. But while the battle raged, Lorgar was conducting a ritual in the system's star, using the deaths from the battle to fuel dark sorcery. The ritual succeeded in creating a ruin storm, a massive warp storm that separated Ultramar from the rest of the galaxy, ensuring that Guilliman could not reach Terra in time to aid the Emperor. While Guilliman and his legion fought to survive the ruin storm and find a way through it, Angron and Lorgar continued their rampage through Ultramar. World after world fell to their combined forces, with Angron, in particular, reveling in the slaughter. The Dark Gods were pleased with Angron's service, and on the world of Nuceria, his former homeworld, they granted him their ultimate gift, ascension to demonhood. Angron became the first Daemon Primarch, transformed from a mortal being into an immortal embodiment of Horn's rage. The transformation was agonizing, breaking Angron's physical form and remaking it into something that existed partially in the warp. He gained immense power, but lost what little remained of his humanity. The process would be repeated with other traitor Primarchs, each one ascending to become a demon prince of their patron god. Far to the galactic west, the Blood Angels were facing their own crisis. Horus, knowing that Sanguinius and his legion represented a significant threat, had lured them to the Cygnus cluster with false reports of a human civilization in need of liberation. Instead, the Blood Angels found a trap laid by the forces of chaos, with the greater demon Kabanda of Khorne leading the demonic assault. The battle on Cygnus Prime was desperate, with the Blood Angels fighting against overwhelming demonic forces. Sanguinius himself dueled Kabanda, eventually defeating the demon in single combat and banishing it back to the warp. But the cost was terrible. The Blood Angels had suffered heavy casualties, and the psychic shock of the conflict had awakened something dark within the Legion's gene seed, a flaw that would plague them for millennia to come. The Dark Angels, meanwhile, were engaged in a campaign against Night Lord's elements when they received word of Horus's betrayal. Lionel Johnson immediately moved to respond, but the ruin storm blocked the most direct routes to Terra. The Lion made a fateful decision to strike at the traitor Forge worlds and supply lines, reasoning that weakening the traitor logistics would be more valuable than trying to force a path through the warp storms. This decision would keep the Dark Angels away from Terra during the crucial early years of the heresy, though they would later play a significant role in battles against the Night Lords and other traitor forces. But L. Johnson's absence from Terra would create problems of its own, as the Lion had left behind half his legion on their homeworld of Caliban, under the command of his former friend Luther. Luther, feeling betrayed that he had been left behind rather than fighting alongside the Lion, began to listen to the whispers of chaos. The seeds of another civil war were being planted, one that would only bear fruit after the heresy's end, when the Dark Angels returned to Caliban and found their homeworld in rebellion against them. The Space Wolves, having been mauled at Prospero, found themselves ambushed in the Alax's Nebula by the Alpha Legion. Alpharius himself led the assault, teleporting aboard Lehman Russ's flagship to confront the Wolf King. The two Primarchs dueled while their legions savaged each other in the void around them. Only the intervention of the Dark Angels' fleet, arriving unexpectedly, saved the Space Wolves from destruction. On Terra itself, Rogel Dawn had been tasked by the Emperor with fortifying the Imperial Palace in preparation for the siege that everyone now knew was coming. Dawn threw himself into this task with characteristic zeal, transforming the already formidable palace into the most heavily defended location in the galaxy. But even Dawn's genius could not make the palace invulnerable, and he knew that when the traitors finally arrived, the defenders would face the fight of their lives. The Imperial fists were joined in the defense of Terra by elements of other loyalist forces that managed to fight their way through to the throne world. The Custodian Guard, the Emperor's personal warriors who had rarely left Terra, prepared for war on a scale they had not seen since the Unification Wars. The Sisters of Silence, an organization of anti-psychic warriors, mobilized to combat the demonic forces that would inevitably accompany the traitors. Perhaps the most unusual aspect of the heresy was the conflict within the Mechanicum itself. When Horus's betrayal became known, roughly half the tech priests sided with the traitors, seeing an opportunity to pursue forbidden knowledge and technologies that the Emperor had declared off-limits. The resulting schism of Mars saw the Red Planet torn apart by civil war, with forge complexes and Titan legions battling each other, while both sides tried to secure valuable archaeotech and STC templates. The fall of Mars to chaos was a catastrophic blow to the Imperium. It deprived the Loyalists of their primary source of war material at the moment they needed it most. Titan legions that should have defended Terra instead marched under the banners of the Dark Mechanicum, their god machines corrupted by chaos and turned against their former masters. This loss would never be fully recovered from, contributing to the Imperium's slow technological decline in the millennia to follow. Amid all this chaos and bloodshed, individual humans and space marines made choices that would echo through history. Garviel Loken, a loyalist captain of the Sons of Horus, who had survived Istvan III, became one of the founders of the Knights Errant, a special force reporting directly to Malkador. Nathaniel Garrow, a Death Guard loyalist who had commanded the Eisenstein's escape, likewise joined this organization. These warriors represented a hope that even in the darkest times, individual honor and loyalty could persist. The war ground on for years, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The traitors controlled roughly half the Imperium and were moving toward Terra, but the loyalists still held the throne world and had time to prepare their defenses. The question became whether Horus could reach Terra before the scattered loyalist legions could unite, and whether the Emperor could hold back the demonic forces in the webway long enough to personally confront his wayward son. Part 11. The Siege of Terra and the Emperor's Sacrifice. By the 7th year of the heresy, Horus had assembled his forces for the final assault on Terra. The traitor legions had fought their way across the galaxy, and now they stood at the doorstep of humanity's cradle world. The fleet that emerged from the warp above Terra was the largest armada ever assembled. Hundreds of thousands of ships, carrying millions of traitor space marines, billions of corrupted Imperial Army soldiers, and countless demons summoned from the warp. The solar system's defenses had been prepared by Rogel Dawn with meticulous care. Every planet, every moon, every asteroid had been fortified and garrisoned. The outer system bristled with weapons platforms and minefields, forcing the traitors to fight for every inch of void. But Horus was not interested in a long siege. He knew that loyalist reinforcements were approaching from multiple directions. The Ultramarines had fought free of the ruin storm. The Dark Angels and Space Wolves were racing toward Terra. If Horus did not achieve victory quickly, he would find himself trapped between the hammer of the defenders and the anvil of the relief force. The battle for the solar system was epic in scope. Pluto fell first, its defenses overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Then Neptune, then Uranus. Each planet cost the traitors dearly, but they had manpower to spare and were willing to spend it freely. The void between planets became a graveyard of ships, with debris fields so thick that they formed artificial asteroid belts. The real bloodshed began when the traitors reached the inner system. The moons of Jupiter and Saturn had been transformed into fortresses, each one capable of threatening entire fleets with their weapons batteries. The traitors bypassed most of these defenses, accepting casualties to rush toward Terra itself. They knew that none of these outer fortifications mattered if they could take the Emperor's palace. The assault on Terra began with an orbital bombardment that would have cracked a less well-defended world. But Dawn's fortifications held, the void shields absorbing punishment that should have been impossible to survive. When the bombardment lifted, drop pods and landing craft descended in numbers that darkened the sky. The traitors landed across Terra's surface, but their primary target was clear: the Imperial Palace itself, the sprawling complex that housed the Emperor and the Golden Throne. The siege of the Imperial Palace lasted for months, with the battle lines shifting back and forth across the same blood-soaked ground day after day. The outer walls fell to the traitors, then were reclaimed by loyalist counterattacks, then fell again. The defending forces fought with desperate courage, knowing that if they failed, humanity would be doomed. The attackers fought with the fury of chaos, bolstered by demonic allies and the dark gifts of their patron gods. Perturabo and Mortarion led the assault on the walls themselves, their siege expertise allowing them to identify weaknesses in Dawn's fortifications. Angron, in his new demonic form, led berserker charges that broke through defensive lines that should have held. Fulgrim and his Emperor's children pursued their own twisted agendas, seeking pleasure in pain rather than caring overmuch about the siege's outcome. The defenders had heroes of their own. Sanguinius held the ultimate gate against chaos for weeks, his presence inspiring the defenders to feats of valor that should have been impossible. Jagatai Khan's White Scars conducted lightning raids behind the traitor lines, disrupting supply and causing chaos in the enemy rear areas. Constantin Valdor and his custodians held the inner palace against all comers, their golden armor shining like beacons of hope in the darkness. But slowly, inexorably, the traitors advanced. The outer palace fell, then the middle defensive rings. The defenders were pushed back toward the inner palace and the Sanctum Imperialis, where the Emperor sat upon the golden throne. It seemed only a matter of time before the traitors would break through completely. Then Horus received news that changed everything. His scouts reported that Reboot Gilliman and the Ultramarines had broken through the system's outer defenses and were approaching Terra. The Dark Angels and Space Wolves were close behind. The relief force was here, and if Horus could not achieve victory before they arrived, the war would be lost. In desperation, Horus made a fateful decision. He lowered the void shields on his battle barge, the Vengeful Spirit, and teleported a massive force of his best warriors to the Imperial Palace's walls. He would break through personally, leading from the front, betting everything on one final assault. But this decision created an opportunity for the Emperor. The Emperor, seeing the Vengeful Spirit's shields lowered, recognized that this was his chance to end the war. If he could teleport aboard the ship and confront Horus directly, he might be able to kill his son and break the traitor's will to fight. It was a desperate gamble, but the Emperor had run out of options. He could not leave the Golden Throne for long without unleashing demons into the palace. But perhaps he could spare enough time for this one crucial mission. The Emperor gathered his most trusted warriors for the boarding action. Rogel Dawn, Sanguinius, a force of custodians, and several Space Marine companies. They teleported to the Vengeful Spirit, but found themselves scattered across the massive vessel by warp disturbances. The Emperor, Sanguinius, and a single custodian found themselves together, while Dawn and the others were deposited elsewhere on the ship. Sanguinius and the Emperor fought their way through the corrupted corridors of the Vengeful Spirit, cutting down traitor Space Marines and demons as they advanced toward the bridge where Horus waited. Sanguinius, who possessed precognitive visions, knew what was coming. He had seen his own death at Horus's hands, and he knew that he was walking toward it. But he also knew that his sacrifice was necessary, that it would create the opening the Emperor needed to strike down the War Master. The Angel and the War Master faced each other in the throne room of the Vengeful Spirit. Horus, no longer truly the son the Emperor had loved, offered Sanguinius a choice: join him in rebellion and be spared, or die. Sanguinius refused, knowing that even in death, loyalty mattered more than survival. The two Primarchs clashed in single combat, Sanguinius fighting with all his skill and fury against a brother who had been enhanced by the power of all four Chaos Gods. Sanguinius fought magnificently, even managing to wound Horus, but the Angel was exhausted from weeks of constant combat defending the ultimate gate. Horus, drawing on the limitless power of chaos, eventually overwhelmed him. The War Master's claw pierced Sanguinius's chest, crushing both his hearts. The Angel of Baal fell, his golden armor stained with his own blood. his sacrifice buying the emperor precious moments. The emperor arrived to find his beloved son dead at Horus's feet. The grief and rage he felt in that moment were terrible to behold, but he controlled them, knowing that emotion alone would not be enough to defeat his corrupted son. Horus taunted the emperor, demanding that he kneel and acknowledge Chaos's supremacy. The emperor refused, and the final battle began. The duel between the emperor and Horus transcended mere physical combat. It was a battle on the psychic plane as well, with both beings channeling powers that could reshape reality itself. The vengeful spirit shook with the force of their conflict, reality fracturing and healing in waves around them. For a moment, it seemed the emperor might lose, for he was still holding back, unwilling to kill the son he still loved, despite all that had happened. Then the emperor saw a lone Imperial army soldier, a man who had survived the boarding action, raise his laser gun against Horus. The War Master, with barely a thought, obliterated the man, burning away not just his body, but his soul. This casual cruelty, the willingness to destroy a brave human who had shown such courage, finally convinced the emperor that Horus was truly lost, that nothing of his son remained in the thing wearing his face. No longer holding back, the emperor unleashed his full might. The psychic assault was so powerful that it burned through Horus's defenses, tearing away the gifts of chaos and leaving him exposed. For just a moment, the real Horus, the son who had once been beloved, looked out through eyes cleared of corruption and whispered a single word: "Sorry." Then the emperor struck the final blow, channeling all his power into a killing strike that obliterated Horus completely, not just destroying his body, but annihilating his soul so thoroughly that not even the Chaos Gods could retrieve it. The War Master was dead, killed by his father, and with him died the last hope of the traitors' rebellion. But victory came at a terrible price. Horus, in their duel, had dealt the emperor wounds that would never heal. The master of mankind, the being who had walked among humans for 40,000 years, was dying. Rogel Dawn, finally reaching the throne room, found his father nearly dead and Sanguinius's body cooling on the floor. With tears streaming down his face, Dawn carried the emperor back to the throne room beneath the palace. The only way to preserve the emperor's life was to place him permanently upon the golden throne. The device that had been designed to power the Webway project would now become his prison and life support, holding his dying body in stasis, while his psychic might continue the work of holding back the demons in the Webway and guiding the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allowed navigators to guide ships through the warp. The emperor would not truly die, but neither could he truly be said to live. He would exist in a state between life and death, his consciousness spread across the entire Imperium, watching over humanity but unable to actively lead or guide his people. The age of the Imperium would begin with humanity's greatest champion reduced to a barely living corpse, sustained only by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers each day, whose souls were fed to the Golden Throne to keep it functioning. Part 12. The Scouring and the Imperium's Reorganization. With Horus dead and the Emperor entombed on the Golden Throne, the Siege of Terra ended. The traitor forces, learning of the War Master's death, lost cohesion. Some fought on out of spite or madness, but most recognized that the war was lost and fled toward the Eye of Terror. The Loyalist reinforcements, arriving in the immediate aftermath of the siege, joined with the defenders in pursuing the fleeing traitors. What followed was a period known as the Great Scouring, lasting from the end of the heresy in ZO14, M31, through approximately 021 M31. The Loyalist forces pursued the traitors across the galaxy, hunting down every last warband and purging every world that had sided with Horus. The traitor legions retreated into the Eye of Terror, that great wound in reality where the laws of physics held no sway and demons walked openly. The scouring was brutal and without mercy. Worlds that had welcomed the traitors were subjected to exterminatus, their entire populations killed and their surfaces rendered lifeless. Space Marines who had turned traitor were hunted to extinction where possible, their gene seed destroyed to ensure they could never rebuild their numbers. The Imperium would not allow any trace of the rebellion to survive if it could be helped. But even as the traitors were being purged, the Loyalists faced their own reckoning. The heresy had revealed fundamental flaws in the Emperor's design. The Primarchs, for all their abilities, had proven vulnerable to corruption. The Space Marine legions had been too powerful, their loyalty too dependent on individual Primarchs who could turn traitor and bring their entire legion with them. Robert Guilliman, having survived the heresy and proven his loyalty beyond doubt, proposed a solution. He compiled his wisdom and tactical philosophy into a document called the Codex Astartes, a comprehensive guide to Space Marine organization, tactics, and recruitment. But the most controversial aspect of the Codex was Guilliman's proposal to break up the legions. Under Guilliman's plan, each legion would be divided into chapters of approximately 1,000 warriors. This would prevent any single individual from commanding the overwhelming military power that the Primarchs had wielded during the heresy. If a chapter fell to corruption, the damage would be limited to 1,000 warriors rather than 100,000. Not all the surviving Primarchs agreed with this proposal. Rogel Dawn initially resisted, seeing it as a slight against the loyalty of the Imperial Fists. Only after a heated debate and a ritual duel did Dawn finally accept the Codex's wisdom. Leman Russ grudgingly agreed, though he maintained that the Space Wolves would adapt the Codex to their own traditions, rather than following it exactly. The Second Founding, as this reorganization became known, created hundreds of new Space Marine chapters from the old legions. The Ultramarines alone spawned dozens of successor chapters, each one maintaining the tactical excellence and discipline that Guilliman had instilled in his sons. The other Loyalist legions likewise saw their forces divided, though some, like the Space Wolves and Salamanders, created fewer successors due to instabilities in their gene seed. Alongside the military reorganization came administrative changes. The Council of Terror, which Malcador had established to govern the Imperium in the Emperor's name, was formalized into the Senatorum Imperialis. The High Lords of Terror, representing the most powerful organizations within the Imperium, would collectively rule in the Emperor's absence. This distributed power structure was intended to prevent any single individual from accumulating enough authority to threaten the Imperium, as Horus had. The Inquisition was founded during this period, granted the authority to investigate threats to the Imperium from within. The Inquisitors operated with nearly unlimited power, answerable only to the Emperor himself, and empowered to command any imperial resource in pursuit of their investigations. 3 main branches, or Ordos, were established. The Ordo Xenos to combat alien threats, the Ordo Malleus to fight chaos, and the Ordo Hereticus to root out corruption within humanity itself. The Grey Knights, a secret chapter of Space Marines designed specifically to combat demonic incursions, were also created during this period. These warriors were drawn from individuals with absolute incorruptibility, their gene seed crafted by the Emperor himself before the heresy. The Grey Knights would operate in complete secrecy, their existence known only to the highest levels of the Imperium, their mission to stand as humanity's final defense against the horrors of the warp. But even as the Imperium reorganized and the traitors were driven into the Eye of Terror, the Primarchs began to disappear. Rogal Dawn was the first to fall, dying in a desperate boarding action against a Chaos fleet. His body was recovered, but only his skeletal hands were returned to the Imperial Fists. Leman Russ departed for the Eye of Terror on a personal quest and never returned. Vulcan vanished, leaving behind promises to return in humanity's darkest hour. Corax, consumed by guilt over his legion's near destruction, followed the traitors into the Eye of Terror to wage a private war against them. The Lion returned to Caliban to find his homeworld in rebellion, Luther and half the Dark Angel's legion having turned to chaos during the Lion's absence. The ensuing battle destroyed Caliban completely. the planet breaking apart and scattering its fragments across the galaxy. The lion disappeared in the final moments, his fate unknown, while Luther was found raving mad in the ruins. The Dark Angels would spend the next 10,000 years hunting their fallen brethren across the galaxy, seeking to purge the stain of betrayal. Robert Guilliman fell on Thessala, mortally wounded by his traitorous brother, Fulgrim's poisoned blade. The Ultramarines managed to place him in stasis before death could claim him, and for 10,000 years he would remain in suspended animation, neither dead nor truly alive, waiting in silence for technology that might heal his wounds. Sanguinius was dead, killed by Horus himself. Ferrus Manus was dead, beheaded by Fulgrim. Only Jagatai Khan disappeared under mysterious circumstances while pursuing Dark Eldar raiders into the webway. The age of the Primarchs had ended, and the age of the Imperium would continue with only mortal men to guide humanity's path. Part 13. The Age of the Imperium, Forging and Consolidation. The centuries immediately following the heresy, known as the Age of Rebirth or the Forging, saw the Imperium consolidate its hold on the galaxy while adapting to life without the Emperor's active guidance. This was a period of reconstruction and establishment, as the systems and institutions that would define imperial society for the next 10 millennia were put into place. The ecclesiarchy, the imperial cult that worshipped the emperor as a god, grew during this period despite the emperor's own rejection of divinity. The common people, knowing only that the emperor had sacrificed himself to save humanity from Horus's rebellion, naturally saw this as a divine act worthy of worship. The fact that the emperor's psychic power continued to manifest through the Astronomicon and occasional miracles only reinforced this view. The Adeptus Ministorum, as the ecclesiarchy was formerly known, grew to become one of the most powerful organizations in the Imperium. It controlled countless shrine worlds, collected massive tithes from believers across the galaxy, and wielded enormous influence over the general population. The emperor's vision of a rational, atheistic society had died with him, replaced by the very superstition and religious faith he had sought to eliminate. The Adeptus Mechanicus, meanwhile, continued to hold their monopoly on technology, though the knowledge they guarded grew increasingly dogmatic. The Mechanicum's transformation into the Mechanicus had solidified their religious beliefs, and the search for STC technology became a sacred quest rather than a scientific endeavor. Innovation was discouraged in favor of maintaining and reverencing existing designs, beginning the technological stagnation that would define the Imperium for millennia. In the 32nd millennium, approximately 500 years after the heresy's end, the Imperium faced a new existential threat. The War of the Beast saw the largest orc invasion in human history, as a unified orc empire under a creature simply called the Beast threatened to overrun the entire Imperium. The Beast was larger and more intelligent than any orc warlord seen before or since, and the orc technology at his command rivaled that of the Imperium itself. The war was devastating. Terra itself was attacked, with orc drop fortresses actually landing on the surface of humanity's homeworld. The Imperial fists, still recovering from losses sustained during the heresy, were nearly wiped out in the defense of Terra. The Last Wall, the 7 successor chapters created from the Imperial fists during the second founding, were forced to reunite and reconstitute the Imperial Fists Legion temporarily. Victory came only through tremendous sacrifice. The Primarch Vulcan, who had been missing since the heresy's end, briefly returned to lead the counterattack. Multiple Space Marine chapters were destroyed entirely, their gene seed lost forever. The Beast was eventually killed, and the Orc Empire collapsed. But the war had shown how vulnerable the Imperium had become. Without the Primarchs and the Emperor, humanity struggled against threats that the legions might have crushed with ease. The centuries that followed saw the Imperium expand to its greatest territorial extent, pushing out in all directions and bringing ever more worlds into compliance. But this expansion came at a cost. The Imperium was spreading itself thin, garrisoning thousands of worlds with limited forces, creating an empire that was vast but brittle. When threats emerged, it often took years or decades for sufficient forces to respond. By the mid-34th millennium, tensions within the Imperium had reached a breaking point. The High Lords of Terror had grown increasingly autocratic and disconnected from the realities of the galaxy. Their decrees were often ignored or implemented poorly by distant governors who resented being ruled by people who had never seen their worlds. The bureaucracy had become bloated and inefficient, with decisions taking years to make and implement. The breaking point came when the Council of Nova Terra, governing the Segmentum Pacificus, formally declared independence from Terra. They claimed that the High Lords had become corrupt and that the Emperor's true vision could only be realized through a reformed government free from Terra's interference. This began the Nova Terra Interregnum, a period of division that would last for 900 years. The Imperium was now split in two, with the Imperium of Terra controlling most of the galaxy and the Imperium of Nova Terra holding the Segmentum Pacificus. Open warfare between the two Imperiums was rare, as both recognized that fighting each other would only weaken humanity in the face of external threats. But the division was real, with each side claiming to be the legitimate successor to the Emperor's vision. The schism even affected the Adeptus Mechanicus, resulting in the Moire Schism. Some tech priests sided with Nova Terra, leading to conflicts between Forge worlds and theological disputes about the true nature of the Omnissiah. The Iron Hands and several of their successor chapters were torn apart by the conflict, with some companies supporting the Moire position while others remained orthodox. The division persisted through the 34th and 35th millennia, only ending with the cataclysm of souls that marked the beginning of the Age of Apostasy. The Ecclesiarchy, which had been growing in power throughout the interregnum, launched a series of religious wars aimed at reuniting the Imperium under their spiritual guidance. The conflict was brutal, with entire worlds being put to the torch for religious deviation. Part 14. The Age of Apostasy and Redemption. The Age of Apostasy, beginning in early M36, was one of the darkest periods in imperial history since the heresy itself. It grew out of the power struggle between the Ecclesiarchy and the Administratum, two of the most powerful organizations within the Imperium. Both claimed to speak for the Emperor, and both sought to control the direction of imperial policy. The crisis came to a head when a man named Goga Vandira simultaneously held the positions of Master of the Administratum and Ecclesiarch of the Adeptus Ministorum. Vandira had risen to power through a combination of political cunning, assassination, and manipulation. Once in control of both organizations, he began a reign of terror that would last for several decades and earn the name Reign of Blood. Vandira purged anyone who opposed him, using his control of the Administratum to identify dissidents and his authority as Ecclesiarch to declare them heretics. He commanded the Frateris Templar, the Ecclesiarchy's military arm, and they carried out his orders with fanatical zeal. Entire worlds were declared heretical and subjected to exterminatus for the slightest resistance to Vandira's rule. The turning point came when a space marine force led by the Imperial Fists arrived on Terra to investigate reports of Vandira's corruption. But Vandira had prepared for this possibility. He had discovered a convent of female warriors on the world of Sanlior, women who had dedicated their lives to defending the faith. Vandira had brought them to Terra and made them his personal bodyguard, renaming them the Brides of the Emperor. These women, later to become the Adepta Sororitas, were fanatically loyal to Vandira, believing him to be the Emperor's chosen representative. When the Space Marines came to arrest Vandira, the brides defended him, creating a standoff that threatened to tear the Imperium apart. The Imperial Fists could have fought through the brides, but doing so would have meant killing women who were, in their own way, trying to serve the Emperor. The impasse was finally broken by a preacher named Sebastian Thor, who had been leading a revolt against Vandire's tyranny. Thor managed to reach the brides and showed them evidence of Vandire's crimes, the innocents he had slaughtered, the corruption he had embraced. The brides, seeing the truth of Vandire's evil, turned on him. Their leader, Alicia Dominica, personally executed Vandire, ending the reign of blood. In the aftermath, Sebastian Thor was named the new ecclesiarch and set about reforming the Adeptus Ministorum. The Thorian Reformation, as it came to be called, established new rules limiting the ecclesiarchy's power. Most notably, the ecclesiarchy was forbidden from maintaining men under arms, preventing them from commanding military forces as Vandire had. But the brides of the emperor, now renamed the Adepta Sororitas, or Sisters of Battle, were allowed to remain as the ecclesiarchy's military arm. The technicality that they were women, not men, satisfied the letter of the law while still giving the church a military force. The sisters would become one of the Imperium's most fearsome fighting forces, their faith making them resistant to chaos corruption, and their training making them deadly warriors. The age of apostasy had further consequences. The Ordo Hereticus, one of the branches of the Inquisition, was specifically tasked with monitoring the ecclesiarchy to prevent another Vandire from seizing power. The Inquisition's power grew, with inquisitors being given authority to investigate and execute even the highest-ranking imperial officials if heresy was suspected. The period following the Age of Apostasy, known as the Age of Redemption, saw the Imperium attempt to heal from the wounds of Vandire's rule. Crusades were launched to reclaim worlds that had fallen to chaos during the period of internal strife. The High Lords of Terror were reconstituted with new checks on their power. The Imperium entered a period of relative stability, though it would never again achieve the unity of purpose it had known during the Great Crusade. The 37th through 40th millennia saw the Imperium gradually decline from its height. Technological knowledge continued to be lost, with the Mechanicus unable to recreate many devices from the dark age of technology. Worlds that had been loyal for thousands of years turned to chaos or were conquered by Xenos species. The Imperium was slowly dying, its vast bureaucracy growing ever more sclerotic, its people increasingly ground down by an endless cycle of war and suffering. New threats emerged during this period. The Tyranids, a Xenos species unlike any previously encountered, began appearing on the eastern fringe of the galaxy. These creatures were a hive mind, consuming all biomass in their path and growing stronger with each world they devoured. The first major Tyranid invasion, Hive Fleet Behemoth, was barely stopped at Macragge, homeworld of the Ultramarines, and it became clear that the Tyranids represented an existential threat to all life in the galaxy. The Tau Empire, a young Xenos civilization in the Damocles Gulf, began expanding aggressively, offering human worlds the choice to join their vision of the greater good, rather than remain under imperial rule. Some human worlds, groaning under the weight of imperial tithes and oppression, actually accepted, leading to the Damocles Crusade as the Imperium sought to reclaim these lost worlds. The Necrons, sleeping in their tomb worlds since the end of the War in Heaven, began to awaken. These ancient beings, with technology that made even the Imperium's greatest weapons seem crude, emerged to reclaim the galaxy they had once ruled. The Imperium, already stretched thin fighting orcs, chaos, Tyranids, and Tau, now had to contend with an enemy older than human civilization itself. Part 15. The Time of Ending and the 13th. Black Crusade. The final century of the 41st millennium, later called the Time of Ending, saw the Imperium face crisis after crisis, with barely any respite. The war for Armageddon alone, fought against the Orc warlord, Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka, consumed resources that might have been used to address other threats. The Gothic War saw Abaddon the Despoiler unleash the Planet Killer, a vessel capable of destroying entire worlds against the Gothic sector. The Black Crusades, periodic invasions launched by chaos forces from the Eye of Terror, had been a recurring threat since the heresy's end. Abaddon, who had become the war master of chaos after Horus's death, had led 12 such crusades over the millennia, each one bringing terror and destruction to imperial worlds. But the 13th Black Crusade, launched in 999 M41, would prove different from all that had come before. Abaddon's target was the Cadian Gate, a stable corridor through the warp storms surrounding the Eye of Terror that allowed imperial forces to monitor chaos activity and prevent easy exit from the Eye. Cadia, the fortress world guarding this passage, had stood against chaos for 10,000 years, its soldiers trained from birth to fight the archenemy. The planet was covered in fortifications, garrisoned by some of the Imperium's best regiments, and protected by numerous Space Marine forces. The 13th Black Crusade was massive, dwarfing all previous Chaos invasions. Abaddon brought not just Chaos Space Marines, but also massive demon armies, corrupted titans, and the full might of the Dark Mechanicum. The battles were apocalyptic in scope, with entire continents of Cadia becoming battlefields where millions died every day. The Imperium threw everything it had at defending Cadia. Space Marine chapters from across the galaxy converged on the system. The Imperial Navy committed thousands of ships. The Cadian Guard fought with a desperation born of knowing that if their world fell, the entire Imperium would be at risk. Inquisitor Katerina Greyfax led forces against the Chaos cult that had infiltrated Cadia's hive cities. Saint Celestine herself, a living saint of the Adepta Sororitas, fought on the front lines. But Abaddon had learned from his previous failures. This time, he was not simply trying to conquer worlds or spread chaos. He had a specific objective: to destroy the Cadian pylons, ancient structures of Necron origin that stabilized reality in the region and helped contain the Eye of Terror. If these pylons were destroyed, the Eye would expand, and the barrier between the material universe and the warp would weaken across a vast region. As the war raged, Abaddon's forces systematically targeted the pylons, destroying them one by one despite desperate Imperial attempts to stop them. With each pylon's destruction, reality grew more unstable, demonic incursions became easier, and the defenders found themselves fighting not just chaos forces, but the very fabric of reality itself. The end came when Abaddon, piloting the Blackstone fortress he had acquired during the Gothic War, rammed the fortress into Cadia itself. The impact was catastrophic, cracking the planet's crust and destroying the last of the pylons. Reality itself screamed as the Eye of Terror expanded suddenly and violently, creating a massive warp storm that would split the galaxy in two. The defenders of Cadia had only moments to evacuate. Lord Castellan Ursarkar Creed, commanding the Cadian defense, chose to remain behind to buy time for the evacuation fleets. He was last seen still fighting as the planet broke apart around him. The Cadian Guard regiments that escaped would carry their world's legacy with them, but Cadia itself was gone, shattered into fragments that still orbit the site where the planet once stood. The expansion of the Eye of Terror combined with other disturbances in the warp to create the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, a massive tear in reality that stretched across the galaxy from pole to pole. This rift divided the Imperium in two, with the side containing Terra, Imperium Sanctus, cut off from the darker half, Imperium Nihilus. The Astronomicon could not penetrate the rift, leaving half the Imperium in darkness, unable to navigate the warp with any reliability. The immediate aftermath of the rift's opening was chaos. Warp storms erupted across the galaxy, making travel impossible for extended periods. Time itself became unstable, with some worlds experiencing centuries while others felt only days pass. demonic incursions skyrocketed as the barrier between reality and the warp weakened. The Imperium, already stretched to the breaking point, seemed on the verge of complete collapse. Part 16. The Return of the Primarch and the Era. Indomitus. It was in this darkest hour that hope returned in an unexpected form. On the world of Macragge, an unlikely alliance of Eldar from Craftworld Bieltan and Imperium forces worked to resurrect Roboute Guilliman from his 10,000-year stasis. The Eldar sought to awaken Iniad, their god of the dead, and believed that working with the Imperium against chaos would serve this goal. Archmagos Belisarius Kol, who had been preparing for this moment for 10 millennia, had finally perfected the technology needed to heal Guilliman's wounds. The resurrection process was perilous and required the intervention of Iniad's emissary, Ivrain, and the power of the Eldar god of death channeled through her. But it worked. Roboute Guilliman, the avenging son, awoke to find himself in an Imperium vastly changed from the one he remembered. The Emperor was entombed on the Golden Throne, his brothers were dead or disappeared, and the Imperium he had helped build had transformed into a nightmare of superstition and oppression. Guilliman was horrified by what had become of his father's dream. The imperial truth had been abandoned in favor of religious fanaticism. Innovation had been replaced by stagnation. The Imperium was dying by inches, and it seemed that nothing could reverse its decline. But Guilliman was nothing if not dutiful. He swore to do what he could to save humanity, even if the Imperium he would save bore little resemblance to the one he had known. The journey to Terra was perilous. Guilliman had to fight his way through chaos forces and navigate the unstable warp. He faced his brother Magnus the Red, now a demon primarch in service to Tsench, in battle on Luna. Only with the help of his unlikely Eldar allies and the Sisters of Silence did Guilliman survive to reach Terra. On Terra, Guilliman met with the Emperor for the first time in 10,000 years. What passed between father and son in that meeting remains unknown, but when Guilliman emerged, he was visibly shaken. He never spoke of what the Emperor said to him, but his determination to save the Imperium seemed reinforced, even if his faith in his father had been shaken. The High Lords of Terra were initially resistant to Guilliman's return, seeing him as a threat to their power. But Guilliman was a Primarch, and he carried the Emperor's sword, a weapon blessed by the Emperor himself. The High Lords had no choice but to accept him as Lord Commander of the Imperium and Imperial Regent, making him the de facto ruler of all humanity. Guilliman's first act was to purge the High Lords, who had become most corrupt and inefficient, replacing them with individuals he judged more capable. His second was to activate a plan he and Kol had been preparing for 10,000 years. The deployment of the Primaris Space Marines. The Primaris Marines were enhanced Space Marines, bigger and stronger than their predecessors, equipped with improved organs and better war gear. Kol had spent 10 millennia refining the Emperor's work, creating these new warriors in secret. Now, Guilliman unleashed them in massive numbers, forming new chapters and reinforcing existing ones with fresh troops. With this new army at his command, Guilliman launched the Indomitus Crusade, the largest imperial military operation since the Great Crusade itself. The goal was to stabilize the Imperium, reclaim lost worlds, and provide relief to the defenders who had been fighting alone since the Great Rift opened. The crusade would last over a century by Terran reckoning, though time distortions meant that different parts of the Imperium experienced the crusade's duration differently. The Indomitus Crusade achieved remarkable success. Hundreds of worlds were liberated from Chaos, Orc, and other Xenos' control. The Primaris Marines proved their worth in countless battles, their superior strength and equipment making them valuable assets. Guilliman's strategic genius allowed Imperial forces to achieve victories that would have been impossible under lesser leadership. But the Crusade could not fix everything. The Great Rift remained, dividing the Imperium and making large-scale coordination impossible. Imperium Nihilus, the dark half of the Imperium beyond the Rift, remained cut off from Terra, forced to survive on its own. Guilliman appointed Commander Dante of the Blood Angels to lead the defense of Imperium Nihilus, one of the few Imperial forces that could still cross the rift with some reliability. During the Crusade, Guilliman fought the Plague Wars, a desperate conflict in Ultramar against Mortarion and the Death Guard. His brother, now a demon Primarch of Nurgle, had invaded Ultramar and corrupted multiple worlds. The war was brutal, with Nurgle's plagues devastating entire populations. Only through tremendous sacrifice and the intervention of the Eldar did Guilliman finally drive Mortarion back into the warp. The Plague Wars revealed both Guilliman's strengths and the limitations he faced. He could win battles through tactical brilliance and the Primaris reinforcements, but he could not truly heal the Imperium. The rot had set in too deep, the institutions too corrupt, the bureaucracy too entrenched. Guilliman was a general leading a dying empire, buying time that might ultimately prove meaningless. Yet Guilliman persevered. He knew that as long as humanity endured, there was hope, however slim. He continued the Indomitus Crusade, expanding Ultramar's borders and creating a model realm that might show other Imperial worlds a better way. He sought out the scattered remains of his brothers, hoping to find others who might have survived. And he prepared for the threats he knew were coming. The galaxy in the era Indomitus remains a place of endless war. The Tyranid hive fleets continue to advance, consuming worlds in their path. The Necrons awaken in ever greater numbers, reclaiming tomb worlds and attacking any who trespass on what they see as their territory. The Orcs grow in power, with Gazgkul, Maguruk Thraka, rebuilding his forces for another massive invasion. The Tau expand their empire, offering humanity's oppressed worlds an alternative to imperial rule. And chaos remains the greatest threat of all. Abaddon has achieved what 12 previous crusades could not: the splitting of the galaxy and the weakening of the barrier between reality and the warp. New demon primarchs have emerged from the Eye of Terror, with rumors suggesting that even Fulgrim may soon return. The servants of the ruinous powers grow bolder, sensing that the Imperium's final days may be approaching. Recent events have brought new hope and new concerns. Lion L. Johnson, the Primarch of the Dark Angels, has awakened from his 10,000-year slumber and rejoined the fight. His return doubles the number of loyalist Primarchs active in the galaxy, though the relationship between the Lion and Guilliman remains complex. The two work together when necessary, but their different approaches and personalities create friction. The Arcs of Omen campaign saw Abaddon attempt to exploit the rift further, using massive space hulks converted into mobile fortresses to strike at Imperial worlds across the galaxy. The campaign was only partially stopped, with several key worlds falling before Abaddon's forces were finally pushed back. The Imperium won, but at tremendous cost, and it became clear that chaos would not rest, that the enemy would continue probing for weaknesses. The current state of the galaxy, in what is now being called the 42nd Millennium by some, remains desperate. The Imperium Sanctus is relatively stable under Guilliman's leadership, but it faces constant assault from all sides. Imperium Nihilus struggles on in darkness, its defenders fighting without hope of reinforcement or even communication with Terra. The Nachmund Gauntlet, a narrow corridor through the Great Rift, offers the only reliable connection between the two halves of the Imperium, and it is constantly contested. But humanity endures. For 10,000 years, the Imperium has faced threats that should have destroyed it. Time and again, it has been pushed to the brink of extinction, only to claw its way back through sheer determination and sacrifice. The Space Marines, the Imperial Guard, the Adepta Sororitas, the Adeptus Mechanicus, all these organizations and more continue to fight, knowing that the alternative to victory is annihilation. The Emperor, though he cannot speak or act directly, remains a presence in the Imperium. His psychic might still powers the Astronomicon, allowing ships to navigate the warp. His consciousness touches the minds of the faithful, granting miracles to those in desperate need. Living saints, warriors resurrected by the Emperor's power, walk the battlefields and turn the tide in humanity's favor. The Emperor may be dying, but he is not yet dead, and as long as he lives, there is hope. Reboot Guilliman works tirelessly to reform the Imperium and prepare it for the challenges ahead. He knows he cannot save everyone, cannot protect every world, cannot prevent every tragedy, but he can buy time, can give humanity a chance to adapt and overcome. He establishes new trade routes, reorganizes the Imperial military, and seeds Primaris Marines throughout the Imperium. His actions give the Imperium a fighting chance, which is more than it had before his return. The Xenos species of the galaxy pursue their own agendas. The Eldar, divided between their craft worlds, their Drukhari cousins in Komorach, and the new Inari faction, seek to survive and possibly save their race from complete extinction. The Tyranids continue their inexorable advance, caring nothing for the politics or conflicts of the lesser races, simply consuming all in their path. The Orcs enjoy the endless fighting, their nature as a warrior race finding perfect expression in a galaxy at war. The Tau still believe their greater good can unite the galaxy, despite mounting evidence that the universe is simply too large and chaotic for any single philosophy to dominate. And the Necrons, ancient and terrible, pursue inscrutable goals, sometimes aiding other races against chaos, sometimes attacking them for trespassing on tomb worlds. The future remains uncertain. Will Guilliman's reforms be enough to save the Imperium? Will more Primarchs return, and if so, will they be loyalist or traitor? Will the Emperor ever rise from the Golden Throne, or will he finally die, taking the Astronomicon and the Imperium's hope with him? Will chaos finally overwhelm the material universe, or can the forces of order push back the ruinous powers once more? These questions have no answers yet. The story of Warhammer 40,000 is ongoing, with new chapters being written even now. But one thing is certain. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. Humanity fights on, not because victory is assured, but because the alternative is too terrible to contemplate. And so the Imperium endures, battered but unbroken, defiant in the face of a hostile universe, carrying the torch of human civilization through the darkness, one battle at a time. From the ancient days of the war in heaven to the current crisis of the era Indomitus, the galaxy has been shaped by conflict and catastrophe. Empires have risen and fallen, species have been created and destroyed. Heroes have sacrificed everything for causes they believed in, and villains have damned billions in pursuit of power. Through it all, humanity has persevered, adapting to each new challenge, surviving against impossible odds. The timeline we have explored spans millions of years, from the dawn of the Old Ones to the present day. It encompasses the rise and fall of the Eldar Empire, the birth of Slaanesh, humanity's climb from terror to the stars, the dark age of technology's wonders, the horror of the Age of Strife, the Emperor's unification wars, the triumph of the Great Crusade, the tragedy of the Horus Heresy, and the long, grinding decline of the Age of the Imperium. We have seen how small decisions can have galaxy-spanning consequences. The Emperor's choice to keep chaos secret from the Primarchs contributed to their fall. Lorgar's need for gods to worship led him to chaos and started the chain of events that would corrupt Horus. Horus's elevation to War Master gave him the authority and opportunity to rebel. Magnus's attempt to warn the Emperor destroyed the Webway project. Each decision, each action rippled forward through time, shaping the galaxy we see today. The universe of Warhammer 40,000 is one without easy answers or comfortable certainties. The Emperor, who tried to guide humanity toward enlightenment, inadvertently created the circumstances for the Imperium's transformation into a theocracy. The Primarchs, designed to be humanity's greatest champions, became the instruments of its near destruction. The imperial truth meant to protect humans from chaos, left them vulnerable when they inevitably encountered demonic forces. Good intentions paved the road to hell, and humanity walks that road still. Yet there is heroism amid the darkness. Space Marines who fight for centuries without rest to protect worlds they have never seen. Imperial Guardsmen who hold the line against impossible odds, knowing they will likely die, but fighting anyway. Inquisitors who sacrifice their humanity to root out threats that could destroy billions. Sisters of battle whose faith gives them strength to face demons and heretics without flinching. These individuals and countless others like them are the true heroes of the Imperium, the ones who keep humanity's flame burning in the darkness. The alien species of the galaxy add further complexity to the conflict. Not all Xenos are mindless monsters. Many have their own cultures, values, and motivations. The Eldar, for all their arrogance, genuinely work to prevent chaos from overwhelming the galaxy. The Tau offer a vision of unity and progress, even if their methods are manipulative and their understanding of the galaxy's true threats is limited. Even the Orcs, primitive as they seem, represent a kind of purity. They fight because that is their nature, without malice or cruelty, simply doing what they were created to do. The forces of chaos represent perhaps the most tragic element of the setting. The Chaos Gods are not external invaders, but reflections of mortal emotions, given form and power. Khorne embodies the rage and bloodlust that lurks in every sentient being's heart. Nurgle represents the acceptance of decay and the cycle of death and rebirth. Tzeentch is the ambition and scheming that drives beings to change their circumstances. Slaanesh is the pursuit of perfection and pleasure taken to its ultimate extreme. In fighting chaos, the Imperium fights against aspects of its own nature, a war that can never truly be won, because the enemy is within. This brings us to the present moment in the timeline, the Era Indomitus, where Guilliman strives to save an Imperium that may be beyond saving. The galaxy stands at a crossroads. The Great Rift has fundamentally changed the strategic situation, splitting the Imperium and empowering chaos in ways not seen since the Horus Heresy. The return of Primarchs, both loyalist and traitor, suggests that the galaxy is entering a new age, one where the demigods of the past once again walk among mortals. The question is whether this new age will see humanity's salvation or its final damnation. Guilliman brings strategic genius and Primaris reinforcements, but he also brings the baggage of the past, the mistakes and grudges of the heresy era. The Lion adds his own strengths and weaknesses to the equation. If more Primarchs return, they will bring both aid and complication, for the Primarchs are powerful but flawed, capable of great deeds but also great errors. The other races of the galaxy watch these developments with their own concerns. The Eldar see the return of the Primarchs as potentially beneficial for their plans to awaken Yniad and defeat Slaanesh. The Necrons view the Imperium's struggles as an opportunity to reclaim their ancient dominion. The Tyranids care nothing for politics or history, simply continuing their consumption of biomass. The Orcs are delighted by the increased fighting, as it gives them more opportunities for war. And Chaos sees weaknesses to exploit, cracks in the Imperium's defenses that might be widened until the entire structure collapses. As we reach the end of this journey through time, we must acknowledge that the story is far from over. New events unfold in the galaxy even now. New heroes rise and fall. New threats emerge from the darkness. The timeline we have explored is not a complete history, but a framework, a skeleton on which countless individual stories hang. Each world in the Imperium has its own history, its own heroes, its own struggles. Each Space Marine chapter has its own saga of battles fought and honors earned. The beauty and the tragedy of Warhammer 40,000 lie in its scope and its darkness. It presents a universe where hope is rare and victory is always temporary, where the best you can hope for is to delay the inevitable, to buy a few more days or years before the darkness claims you. Yet, within that darkness, individuals choose to fight anyway, to stand against the night, even knowing they cannot ultimately prevail. That choice, that defiance in the face of impossible odds, is what makes humanity worthy of survival. The Emperor's vision, whatever it truly was, has not been realized. The Imperium he founded is a cruel parody of what he might have intended, a theocratic nightmare that grinds its own citizens beneath the wheels of its bureaucracy and feeds them to the war machine without mercy or remorse. But it endures. Somehow, against all odds, humanity survives, and as long as it survives, there is a chance, however small, that things might improve. This has been the complete timeline of Warhammer 40,000, from the War in Heaven to the Era Indomitus, from the first stirrings of human civilization to the present crisis that threatens to end it all. We have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of gods, and the endless struggle of countless beings fighting for their survival in an uncaring universe. We have seen how the mistakes of the past echo through millennia, how good intentions can lead to terrible outcomes, and how even in the darkest times, there are those who choose to fight for what they believe is right. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the lore and history of Warhammer 40,000, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me create more content like this, exploring the rich and complex universe that Games Workshop has created. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. And remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there are also heroes and stories worth telling, and that is enough.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.